We're moments away from the opening bell. Joe Louis, heavyweight champion of the world, comes out for round one in the dark trunks with the white stripe. Max Schmeling is wearing the all-dark trunks.
In the summer of 1938, a black man from the cotton fields of Alabama stepped into Madison Square Garden, looked across a boxing ring at the living symbol of Aryan supremacy, and knocked him unconscious in 124 seconds. The entire country erupted. Every radio in every home and bar and church hall in Black America went silent in the moments before it happened, and then it didn't stay silent for long. The President of the United States called him on the telephone and said words that no American president had ever said to a black man in quite that way before. He said, "We need muscles like yours to beat Germany." He said it and meant it. And then, when the war actually came, the country that called this man a national hero put him in a segregated unit, stationed him at a base where German prisoners of war could eat in the same mess hall that he was not allowed to enter. And when it was all over, when the fascists were defeated and the country was celebrating, it sent him home to a nation where he still could not vote in most of the states where he had been born. That is not a footnote. That is the whole story. This is the story of what black Americans did to fascism, what they risked to do it, what the country promised them for doing it, and what the country actually delivered. It is the story of men and women who fought a war on two fronts simultaneously. One front in Europe and North Africa and the Pacific, and one front at home inside the country they were being asked to die for. It is the story of Jesse Owens standing in Hitler's stadium and winning 4 gold medals while the country that sent him there refused to send the president's congratulations. It is the story of Joe Louis, the brown bomber, who became the most important athletic figure in America not despite his blackness, but because of it. Because what he represented in a boxing ring in 1938 was something no diplomat, no general, no speech could have represented as cleanly or as powerfully. It is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, who were told officially by the United States Army that black men lacked the mental capacity to fly combat aircraft, and who then went to war and flew more than 15,000 sorties and never lost a single bomber they were assigned to escort. Not one. It is the story of Dory Miller, a mess attendant on a Navy ship, a man whose official job was to cook and serve food because the United States Navy did not consider black men capable of combat, who on a December morning in 1941 picked up a machine gun he had never been trained to use and shot down Japanese aircraft while burning ships sank around him, and who spent years fighting the Navy's bureaucracy for the recognition that any white sailor doing the same thing would have received automatically. These are not stories that appear in most textbooks. They are not absent from history. They are absent from the version of history that America has chosen to tell about itself, which is a different thing. And the difference matters, because you cannot understand what fascism was, what it meant, what it threatened, without understanding the specific irony of the people most clearly qualified to recognize and fight it. The people who had been living under a version of it on American soil for generations. That is what this documentary is about. Not a simple story. Not a triumphant one, though there is triumph in it. Not a tragedy either, though there is tragedy in it. It is the story of human beings who were handed a contradiction so enormous it should have been crushing, and who picked it up and carried it, and then used it to change the country that handed it to them. It is the story of what it means to fight for something you have not been allowed to fully have. And it is the story of why that fight, that specific fight, against fascism, against the ideology that said some humans were biologically superior and others were biologically destined to serve them, mattered more to black Americans than to perhaps anyone else on earth. Because black Americans already knew what that ideology produced. They had been living inside a domestic version of it since before the country was founded. They knew what it looked like when the state decided some people were less than human. They knew what it looked like when that decision was written into law, enforced by courts, maintained through economic control and systematic violence. They knew it not as abstraction, not as foreign threat, but as the texture of daily life, the separate water fountains, the separate schools, the sheriffs, The debt that could never be paid off because it was designed never to be paid off. The men with torches on Wednesday nights. The understanding, taught to every black child in the South from the moment they were old enough to understand anything, that there were places you could not go, things you could not say, ways you could not look at white people, and that violating any of these rules, any of them, for any reason, could get you killed, and there was not a court in the country that would do anything about it. They knew what fascism was. They had a different name for it, but they knew what it was. And when Hitler rose in Germany in 1933 and began publicly articulating the ideology that some races were superior and others were subhuman, and when that ideology began expressing itself in laws stripping Jewish Germans of citizenship, of property, of the right to work in their professions and marry who they chose, there were black Americans watching who found the architecture of it familiar, not identical. Nothing is ever identical in history, but familiar in the way that a person who has been in one kind of darkness can recognize another kind when it arrives. Walter White, the executive director of the NAACP, said it plainly. He said that Negroes in America understand the position of Jews in Germany, perhaps better than any other group of Americans, because we have known what it means to be treated as second-class citizens. He said that in 1933. He said it before most white Americans were willing to use the word genocide in the same sentence as anything happening in Europe. That understanding would shape everything that followed. It would shape how black newspapers covered Hitler's rise, while white newspapers were still calling him a curiosity. It would shape why black Americans followed the career of a heavyweight boxer from Detroit named Joe Louis, with an intensity that went far beyond sports. It would shape why the 4 gold medals won by a black sprinter from Ohio in a Berlin stadium in August of 1936 felt like the most significant athletic achievement in American history, not because of the athletic achievement itself, but because of who was watching and what they needed to see, and what seeing it meant for what they had been told about themselves and their place in a world that seemed to be dividing itself into the people who mattered and the people who did not. To understand all of that, you have to understand the America that produced these men. And the America that produced them was not the America that appears in the photographs from that era. The one with the white picket fences and the big band music and the feel of a country finding its stride. That America existed. It was real for the people it included. But it existed alongside a different America. A parallel country occupying the same geography, governed by different laws, enforced by different violence, and inhabited by a population that had been told in every legal and social and economic way available to a society that they were not fully part of the nation they had built. Go back to 1936. Go back to what black Americans in 1936 were actually living inside. The Great Migration had been underway for 20 years by then, and millions of black Americans had left the rural South for the industrial cities of the North, Chicago, and Detroit, and Cleveland, and New York, fleeing a system of racial control called Jim Crow that operated in the South with the systematic comprehensiveness of an occupation. But leaving the South had not meant leaving behind everything the South had built into the structure of American life. The North had its own architecture of exclusion, redlining, the practice, codified by federal policy and enforced by banks and real estate associations, and sometimes violence, of preventing black families from buying homes in certain neighborhoods, from accessing the government mortgage programs that were building the white middle class out of the wreckage of the Depression, from accumulating the property that every subsequent generation of wealth in America runs through. Black workers in northern factories made more than black workers in southern fields, but they were paid less than white workers doing identical work, assigned to the most dangerous jobs, the last hired and the first fired when the economy turned. The unions that might have protected them often excluded them explicitly. The political machines that governed northern cities delivered services to white ethnic neighborhoods and delivered much less to black ones. Northern schools were better than southern schools in the way that insufficient is better than nothing. They were not equal. They were not close to equal. They were simply a different kind of unequal. And the Depression had hit black America harder than almost any other community in the country, Because when you begin with less, when you have been systematically excluded from the wealth accumulation of the previous decades, when your economic position was already precarious before the stock market collapsed in 1929, there is less cushion between a downturn and catastrophe. Black unemployment in northern cities during the worst years of the Depression reached levels that white Americans in the same cities would not experience until it was already too late to absorb the blow. The charity and government relief programs that existed often excluded black applicants, turned them away from breadlines, denied them the benefits that white families were receiving. There are documented cases in cities across the north of black families literally starving during years, when white families in the same city were merely hungry. This is the America that Jesse Owens grew up in. This is the America that Joe Louis came from. This is the country that produced the Tuskegee Airmen, that pushed Dory Miller to the kitchen of a Navy ship and told him that was the highest position available to a man of his abilities. This is the context inside which everything that follows has to be understood, not as background color, as the essential ground on which everything else stands. Because the question that runs through all of these stories is not simply what did these men do? The question is, what did it mean for them to do it? What did it cost? What did they understand about what they were doing that the country around them did not understand, or refused to understand, or understood perfectly well and chose not to say out loud? What is the specific texture of fighting for something you have not been allowed to have? And what does it mean when that fight, against an ideology that the rest of the world eventually recognized as evil, was being waged by people who were living under a domestic version of the same ideology, fighting it overseas while their families were experiencing it at home, writing letters from military bases in England and France and the Pacific to wives and mothers who were still being told where to sit on buses? That is not a simple story. It does not fit on a medal. It does not resolve cleanly into triumph or tragedy. It is what it actually is, which is more complicated and more important and more worth sitting with than any clean version of it could ever be. So that is where we are going. Into the specifics, into the individual lives and what they meant and what they cost and what they changed, into the boxing rings and the Olympic stadiums and the airfields and the tank formations and the Navy ships and the newspaper offices, where black journalists were covering a world war, while simultaneously covering a domestic civil rights crisis, and doing both with the understanding that they were the same story, that the fight against fascism abroad and the fight against racism at home were not two different fights, but one fight with two fronts. We are going to start in a stadium in Berlin. We are going to start in the summer of 1936, when Adolf Hitler had been in power for 3 years, when the official ideology of the German state was that certain people were racially superior and others were biologically destined for subordination or elimination, when that ideology was being watched by the whole world and debated by governments and editorialized about in newspapers, when the International Olympic Committee had decided that Berlin was a perfectly acceptable place to hold the games, that sport and politics were different things and should not be confused. A decision that black Americans watching the coverage of Germany from the inside of Jim Crow America might have found more than a little familiar in its logic. We are going to start with a young man named James Cleveland Owens, born in Oakville, Alabama, the son of sharecroppers, a man who had moved north with his family to Cleveland as part of the Great Migration, who had found in running what some people find in the things they are built to do. Not just talent, not just speed, though the speed was extraordinary and verifiable, and would become one of the most documented athletic facts of the century. Something beyond speed, some quality of motion that made people who watched him run feel that what they were seeing was not simply athletic performance, but argument, evidence, proof of something that the world around him was actively trying to disprove. His name was Jesse Owens. He was 22 years old. He was about to go to Berlin. And what happened when he got there was going to become one of the most famous stories of the 20th century, and also one of the most misunderstood. And the misunderstanding matters, Because the version of the story that most people know is a comfortable one, and the truth is less comfortable and more important. And the difference between those two things is where the real meaning lives. That is where we are going next. His name was not Jesse. His name was James Cleveland Owens, and he was born on September 12th, 1913, in a sharecropper's cabin in Oakville, Alabama, the 10th child of Henry and Emma Owens, who farmed cotton on land that belonged to a white man under terms that guaranteed the debt would never be paid off. That was the design. Not negligence. Not bad luck. Design. The same design that shaped every black sharecropping family in the Alabama of 1913, a system engineered with the specific purpose of keeping black labor attached to white land through a ledger that could never balance, enforced by a law that treated leaving as a crime and protected by a violence that required no legal justification at all. James Cleveland Owens grew up knowing that design from the inside. He knew what it looked like when his father worked a full season and came out of it with less than he had started. He knew what it felt like to be sick with no access to a doctor, because the doctors in the county did not treat black patients, or treated them in back rooms after the white patients were done. He knew what it meant to go to a school that operated only when it did not interfere with the cotton harvest, which meant a school that operated when white farmers decided black children were not needed in the fields, which meant a school that operated at the convenience of the system that was trying to make education impossible. He was 7 years old when the family made the decision. His father, Henry, had a cousin in Cleveland, Ohio. The cousin had a job in a steel mill. The wages seemed impossible by Alabama standards. The family looked at the cabin and the debt and the cotton fields and the things that happened on Wednesday nights in that county, and they did what 6 million black American families did between 1910 and 1970. They got on a train and went north. Cleveland in the 1920s was not freedom. It was a different kind of constraint, a northern version of the architecture of exclusion, separate in its methods from Jim Crow, but not as different in its outcomes as the brochures implied. The Owens family settled in a neighborhood on the east side of Cleveland that was filling with black migrants from the south, families with the same story, the same debt, the same Wednesday nights in their memories, looking for something that the North kept promising without quite delivering. Henry Owens found work. The children found schools. The schools had desks and ran 12 months a year, and the teachers called the children by their names. These were not small things. They were not nothing, but they were not equality, and everyone involved knew it. In one of those schools, a junior high school teacher mispronounced the boy's name. He had said JC. She heard Jesse. He was too polite to correct her. Too conditioned, probably, by every lesson a black child in that era absorbed about how to move carefully through spaces controlled by white people. He let it go. The name stuck. James Cleveland Owens became Jesse Owens and remained Jesse Owens for the rest of his life, which is a small detail that contains inside it an entire history of how black Americans in that era navigated the world, making accommodations so constant and so small that each one seemed like nothing, and all of them together were everything. The running started at Fairmount Junior High. His coach was a man named Charles Riley, a white track coach who saw something in the skinny boy from Alabama that other people were not looking at carefully enough to see. Riley did something that very few people in Jesse Owens' life had done. He paid attention. He came in early before school started because Jesse had to work after school and could not stay for afternoon practice. And he coached him in the mornings, one-on-one, over months and then years, teaching him not just technique, but something harder to name. Teaching him to believe that what he could do was real, that the speed was real, that what happened when his feet touched a track was not a fluke or an accident, but a fact about who he was and what he was capable of. Riley became one of the most important figures in Jesse Owens' life. He understood something that coaches who work with black athletes in that era often had to consciously choose to understand. That the talent in front of him was not a commodity to extract value from, but a human being to develop. That is not a given. In the America of the 1920s and 1930s, The relationship between white coaches and black athletes carried the weight of every power imbalance in the broader culture. Riley chose to be different. Owens remembered him for the rest of his life as the man who most shaped who he became. At East Technical High School in Cleveland, Jesse Owens began to become something the country had not quite seen before. He tied the world record in the 100-yard dash as a high school senior. He jumped 24 feet, 9.5 inches in the broad jump, a performance that would have won him a medal at the previous Olympics. College recruiters came. He chose Ohio State University, which is where the America that had encouraged his talent and the America that had never stopped categorizing him by his race met each other face to face. Ohio State did not offer Jesse Owens a scholarship. He had to work while his white teammates did not. He could not live in the dormitories on campus. He lived in a boarding house off campus that accepted black students because the university housing did not. When the team traveled for meets, he ate at restaurants that served black customers through the back door or not at all, stayed in boarding houses while his teammates stayed in hotels, sat in the back of team buses while the white athletes sat in the front. He was the most talented athlete on the team. He was possibly the most talented track athlete in the country, and he ate his meals through back doors and slept in boarding houses, and the university that was displaying his talent to the country did not consider him fully qualified to sleep in the same building as his teammates. He did not make speeches about this. He did not organize protests or write letters to newspapers. He ran. There are people who look at that and see accommodation, a man accepting conditions he should have refused. That reading misunderstands the options available to a black man at Ohio State University in 1933, and it misunderstands what Jesse Owens was doing with the running itself. The running was not a retreat from the indignity of the back doors and the boarding houses. The running was the answer to it. Every record he broke was a fact that the ideology behind the back doors could not absorb. You cannot argue with a stopwatch. On May 25th, 1935, at the Big Ten Championships in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Jesse Owens did something that has never been done before or since in the history of track and field. In 45 minutes, he set 3 world records and tied a 4th: the 100-yard dash, the 220-yard dash, the 220-yard low hurdles, and the broad jump, all in 45 minutes, all at a level no human being had ever reached before. Sports writers struggled with the language. They reached for the word impossible and then had to reach past it because impossible implies it did not happen. And it had happened. It was documented. It was witnessed by thousands of people. It was measured by officials using equipment that had no reason to lie. One writer called it the greatest single athletic performance in the history of the sport, and nobody who was there argued with him. A year later, Jesse Owens boarded a ship for Germany. The 1936 Berlin Olympics were not simply a sporting event. They were, by design, a political statement. Adolf Hitler had been in power for 3 years. The official ideology of the German state was that the Germanic peoples represented the pinnacle of human evolution and that other races were biologically inferior. The Nazis had already passed the Nuremberg Laws in 1935, stripping Jewish Germans of citizenship, prohibiting marriage between Jews and non-Jews, constructing the legal architecture of a racial hierarchy that would eventually produce the Holocaust. This was not hidden. This was announced. The Nuremberg Laws were published in newspapers. The ideology was spoken about openly by government officials in official contexts. It was not a conspiracy. It was a policy. And the International Olympic Committee decided that Berlin was an appropriate place to hold the Games. Inside the United States, a debate erupted about whether to send an American team. The American Jewish Congress and the NAACP both called for a boycott. They argued that participating in the Berlin Games legitimized a government that had constructed its entire political identity around the biological inferiority of certain groups of people. They argued that athletes, Jewish and black athletes in particular, would be entering a country whose government had officially decided they were subhuman. They argued that the line between sport and politics that the Olympic Committee liked to draw did not exist in this case, that stepping into that stadium was itself a political act, regardless of whether you wanted it to be. The president of the American Olympic Committee was a man named Avery Brundage. He traveled to Germany to investigate the conditions. He reported back that everything was fine. He said the situation of Jewish athletes in Germany was not his concern. He said sport and politics were different things. He said the games should proceed. He pushed through the American team's participation over the objections of the groups calling for boycott. Brundage was not a peripheral figure. He ran the American Olympic movement for years, and later ran the International Olympic Committee. His response to the 1936 situation was entirely consistent with a worldview that saw the political arrangements of the country hosting the Games as secondary to the smooth functioning of the athletic competition. That worldview had consequences. Jesse Owens was not particularly political. He had not been vocal in the boycott debate. He was a runner. He wanted to run. And in the summer of 1936, he got on a ship with the American team and crossed the Atlantic toward a country whose government had decided that men like him were less than human, and he prepared to compete in their stadium. He won 4 gold medals. Say that again slowly, because the number is important, and the context is what makes it stagger the mind. 4 gold medals. In a single Olympics. In the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the long jump, and the 4x100 relay. In the stadium of a government whose ideological project was the biological superiority of the Aryan race. In front of 110,000 spectators, many of them true believers in that ideology. In front of newsreel cameras broadcasting to the world. In front of Adolf Hitler himself, sitting in his box, watching a black man from the Alabama cotton fields systematically dismantle every athletic claim his government had staked its identity on. The 100 meters. He won it in 10.3 seconds, tying the world record. The long jump. This is where the story gets more complicated and more human and more worth dwelling on than the simple gold medal makes it seem. Jesse Owens nearly did not qualify for the long jump final. He had fouled twice in the qualifying rounds, which meant one more foul would eliminate him from the event entirely. He was standing at the edge of the runway, trying to recalibrate when a German athlete approached him. His name was Luz Long. He was tall and blonde and built like the Aryan ideal that the regime was in the business of celebrating. He was also one of Jesse Owens' main competitors in the event. He walked over and gave Owens advice. He suggested adjusting his mark, starting his approach from a point further back, so the takeoff would fall safely inside the legal zone. It was practical athletic advice. It was also, in that specific stadium, in that specific political context, an act of some moral courage. A German athlete helping a black American athlete in Adolf Hitler's Olympic Stadium was not a neutral gesture. It was a choice. Long knew it was a choice. He made it anyway. Jesse Owens qualified. He set the Olympic record in the final. He won the gold medal. Luz Long won the silver. And then, in front of 110,000 people and the cameras and Hitler in his box, Jesse Owens and Luz Long walked arm in arm around the track. 2 men from countries that were moving toward war. One of them the embodiment of the ideology the other country would soon spend everything to defeat, walking together. Having recognized something in each other that the political context of the moment said they should not have been able to recognize. Jesse Owens later said that Luz Long was the best friend he ever had, and that it had taken a lot of courage for Long to befriend him in front of Hitler. Luz Long would die on the beaches of Sicily in 1943, fighting for the country whose ideology he had quietly defied in Berlin. He and Owens corresponded until Long's death. Long asked Owens in his last letter to find his son after the war and tell him about their friendship. Owens found the son. He told him. That is a different story from the one about gold medals and political symbolism, though it contains all of that too. It is a story about what 2 human beings chose to do with the space between them in a context specifically designed to make that space unbridgeable. Now, the Hitler snub. You have almost certainly heard the story. Adolf Hitler, furious at Jesse Owens' performance and what it meant for his racial ideology, refused to acknowledge the black American champion, would not shake his hand, turned away from him in visible contempt. The story appeared in American newspapers immediately after the games. It has been repeated in textbooks and documentaries and classrooms ever since. It is satisfying as a story because it fits perfectly into a clear moral framework. The embodiment of evil refusing to acknowledge the man who had just exposed his ideology as nonsense. It is a good story. It is not what happened. What actually happened was this. On the first day of the games, Hitler had greeted several gold medalists personally in his box. He greeted some German athletes. He greeted 2 Finnish athletes. He did not greet Cornelius Johnson, a black American who had won the high jump on that first day. Whether that was intentional racial snubbing or scheduling is disputed. The IOC responded by telling Hitler that he must either greet all gold medalists publicly or greet none of them. Hitler chose to greet none of them. By the time Jesse Owens won his medals, Hitler was not greeting any athletes. He was not snubbing Owens specifically. He had removed himself from the greeting ritual entirely. Jesse Owens himself said this. He said it more than once. He said that Hitler had stood up and waved at him, and he waved back. He said that the story about being snubbed by Hitler was not true. He said that he had not been snubbed in Berlin. He said the snub came later. He said it came from the president of his own country. Franklin Delano Roosevelt sent telegrams to every white American gold medalist at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. He invited every white American gold medalist to the White House. Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals. He received no telegram. He received no invitation. He returned to New York to a ticker tape parade because the country was not above celebrating what he had done with its attention, even when it was not willing to acknowledge him with its respect. And then he went to a reception held in his honor at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Manhattan. He was not allowed to use the front door. He was directed to the freight entrance, the service elevator. He rode up to his own reception in a freight elevator because the Waldorf Astoria did not permit black guests to use the main entrance, and the city of New York and the country of the United States had no law preventing this, and no interest in making an exception for the man who had just won 4 Olympic gold medals in Adolf Hitler's stadium. He walked into the reception that was honoring him through the same door that the kitchen deliveries used. Think about what that requires of a person, what you have to do internally to walk through that door. Not the physical act of walking through it, the psychological architecture that allows you to keep moving forward in the face of that specific, precise, deliberate humiliation. To not let it break something that cannot be repaired. To understand it for what it is and what it means, and still continue. Still perform. Still be present in the room. Still accept the applause from the people who had just sent you through the service entrance. Jesse Owens was 22 years old. He had won 4 gold medals. He had done something in that Berlin stadium that the country would talk about for the next 100 years. And he rode the freight elevator up to his own reception and walked through the service door and did not publicly fall apart, which is not because he didn't feel it, but because feeling it and surviving it was something black Americans in 1936 had been doing every day of their lives since before Jesse Owens was born. The freight elevator was not an exception to his experience. It was a continuation of it. Roosevelt never acknowledged him. Not a telegram, not a phone call, not a public word of congratulations. The White House did not communicate with Jesse Owens after his 4 gold medals in any form. He later said simply that he was not invited to the White House and that it was not a good feeling. He said it without excessive anger, which is either a testament to his character or to the degree to which he had been prepared by a lifetime of experience to absorb this particular kind of treatment. Probably both. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. What happened next to Jesse Owens is the part of the story that the comfortable version leaves out. He came home from Berlin broke. He needed money. He was 22 years old and the most famous athlete in America, and he could not leverage that fame into financial stability because the infrastructure that turned athletic celebrity into money in 1936 did not include black athletes in its planning. The endorsement deals that white athletes received were not available to him. The speaking circuit paid poorly and inconsistently. The Amateur Athletic Union, which governed track and field, stripped him of his amateur status when he left on a barnstorming tour to earn money rather than accepting an AAU organized tour of Europe that paid the white athletes but not him. He had not been offered the same terms. He had been offered the opportunity to participate, which is not the same thing. He raced horses, literally. He accepted appearance fees to race against horses at fairgrounds and exhibitions across the country, because the economics of being Jesse Owens in 1936 required it. He was the fastest man on earth. He raced horses for money, and he was aware of the absurdity of it and the degradation of it. And he did it anyway, because his family needed to eat, and this was what was available. Later in life, he became a goodwill ambassador. He traveled the world representing the United States, speaking about the values of the country. There are photographs of him smiling in foreign capitals, suited and silver-haired, representing the nation that had sent him through the freight elevator. He did this work seriously. He believed in America as an ideal, even when the America he lived inside failed to live up to it, which is a form of faith that is either admirable or something more complicated or both, and honest people can disagree about which. But he did the work. He showed up. He represented. He died in 1976. He was 62 years old. He had lived long enough to see some of what his performance in Berlin had planted finally grow into visible form. The civil rights legislation of the 1960s. The gradual dismantling of the most explicit legal structures of American apartheid. Young black athletes competing openly for the same endorsements and opportunities that had been closed to him. Whether he considered that a sufficient accounting for what his generation had paid is a question only he could have answered. And by the time the question could be asked with any real weight, he was gone. But in August of 1936, in a Berlin stadium, in front of a man who had built a political movement on the claim that Jesse Owens' existence was an evolutionary inferior accident, Jesse Owens ran. He ran the way he had always run, the way Charles Riley had taught him to run in the mornings before school in Cleveland, the way he had run at Ohio State through the back doors and the boarding houses and all the rest of it. He ran the way people run when they have something to prove that cannot be contained in words. And he won. 4 times. And the stopwatch did not lie. And the jump did not lie. And the distance did not lie. Whatever the country did with that afterward, whatever the hotel did with him, whatever the president decided not to do, those 4 gold medals happened. They are in the record. They cannot be taken back. Jesse Owens did not fix racism. He did not dismantle Jim Crow. He did not change what awaited him when he got home. But for 10 days in August in Berlin, he stood in the middle of the most elaborate public performance of the ideology of white supremacy ever staged in modern history, and he systematically, methodically, and irrefutably proved it wrong. And the man it was supposed to honor had to sit in his box and watch. That matters. Not as the end of the story. As a moment inside a much longer story whose ending has not yet been written. That is Jesse Owens. Now we need to talk about Joe Louis, because Joe Louis is a different kind of story, and in some ways a harder one. And the 2 men together are not simply 2 athletes who happen to be black in an era of fascism. Together, they are the outline of something. 2 points of a line that runs through everything else this documentary is about. The line between what a single person can do inside a system and what a system requires to actually change. Jesse Owens ran in Berlin and won 4 gold medals and came home to the freight elevator. Joe Louis stepped into a ring in New York City on June 22, 1938, and did something that was different in kind from anything an athletic performance had ever done in American history. That is where we are going next. His managers gave him a list of rules before he turned professional. Not training rules, not dietary guidelines. Rules for how to exist in public as a black man who was about to become famous in an America that was not prepared to handle black fame without conditions attached to it. The rules were these. He was never to be photographed alone with a white woman. He was never to go to a nightclub by himself. He was never to gloat over a fallen white opponent. He was to keep a neutral expression in photographs, no wide smiles, nothing that could be read as arrogance or aggression or any emotional state that made white audiences uncomfortable. He was to be, in every public context, precisely what the white American sports audience needed him to be, which was dominant enough to be entertaining and controlled enough to be safe. He was to win without appearing to enjoy it too much. He was to be exceptional without being threatening. He was to perform the impossible act of being the best heavyweight boxer in the world, while making the people who were uncomfortable with black excellence feel comfortable watching it. His name was Joe Louis. He was born Joseph Louis Barrow on May 13, 1914, in a sharecropper's cabin outside Lafayette, Alabama, which means he was born 1 year after Jesse Owens, and in circumstances almost identical in their poverty, and their geography, and their position inside the architecture of Jim Crow. His father, Monroe Barrow, was committed to a mental institution when Joe was 2 years old. His mother, Lily, remarried a man named Pat Brooks, who had 5 children of his own. The merged family of 13 people lived and worked and survived on a rented farm in rural Alabama, with a specific kind of precariousness that is not poverty in the abstract, but poverty as a daily physical fact, as the texture of every meal and every winter and every calculation about what can be afforded and what cannot. When Joe Louis was 12 years old, his stepfather Pat Brooks loaded the family onto a truck and drove north. Not a train. A truck. The family was too large and too poor for the train, so they drove to Detroit in a truck because Detroit in 1926 was what Chicago had been 10 years earlier and what Cleveland had been when the Owens family arrived, which was a city promising something better than Alabama, even when the something better was qualified and partial, and came with its own architecture of exclusion. His mother had a sister in Detroit. There were jobs in the Ford plant. There was a school that ran 12 months a year. There was no guarantee of anything else, but there was that. Joe Louis arrived in Detroit at 12 years old, not speaking standard English well, behind in school, the son of an institutionalized father, and a mother who had been working cotton fields since childhood. He struggled in school. He was assigned to a trade school for students who were not expected to go to college. He took violin lessons because his mother wanted him to. He spent the money on boxing lessons at the Brewster East Side Gymnasium instead. He was 16 years old. Within a year, it was clear that something was happening that the violin could not have produced. The Brewster Gym was the center of black athletic life on Detroit's East Side, and the man who ran the boxing program there looked at Joe Louis and saw what Charles Riley had seen in Jesse Owens, which was not simply talent, but a quality of talent that exists at a different level from other talent. The kind that makes coaches who have spent their entire lives working with talented people suddenly quiet and careful, aware that they are in the presence of something they need to handle correctly. His amateur career was brief and overwhelming. He lost his first amateur fight. He then won 50 of his next 54 bouts. 38 of those wins came by knockout. He turned professional in 1934, managed by John Roxborough and Julian Black, 2 black businessmen from Detroit and Chicago who understood exactly what they had and what the country they were operating in required them to do with it. They brought in Jack Blackburn as trainer, a former lightweight who was one of the best technical boxing coaches alive, and who looked at the 20-year-old from Alabama and began building the most complete heavyweight fighter the sport had ever seen. The jab, the straight right hand, the body work, the footwork, the capacity to absorb a punch without going down that distinguished the truly great heavyweight from the simply excellent one. Blackburn built all of it, and then Roxborough and Black gave him the rules, and Joe Louis followed them, because Joe Louis understood, with the understanding of a man who had grown up in the South and moved north and lived his entire life inside an America that required black people to manage white comfort as a condition of their own survival, that the rules were not arbitrary. They were the price of entry, not into boxing, into America. The rules were also a form of protection. Roxborough and Black were not naive men. They had watched Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion, who had refused to manage white comfort, who had dated white women openly and spoken arrogantly to white journalists and driven expensive cars and worn expensive clothes and refused every performance of deference that the white American sports world expected of him. Jack Johnson had been prosecuted under the Mann Act, a federal law ostensibly about transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes, in a case that was transparently about punishing a black man for refusing to stay in his designated place. he had been forced into exile. He had been stripped of his title in a fight arranged specifically to restore the heavyweight championship to a white man. He had died in a car accident in 1946, still regarded by much of white America as a cautionary tale rather than what he actually was, which was a man of extraordinary courage who paid an extraordinary price for refusing accommodations he should never have been asked to make. Joe Louis was not Jack Johnson, not because he lacked courage, because he made a different calculation about what courage required in 1934, and because Roxborough and Black made that calculation with him. The rules were the price of building something that could eventually be larger than the rules. Follow the rules, win the fights, become undeniable, become the thing the country cannot look away from, and then see what can be built from that position. It was a strategy, it was not a surrender. It worked. By 1935, Joe Louis was fighting in Madison Square Garden. By June of that year, he had knocked out Primo Carnera, a former heavyweight champion, in 6 rounds. He was 21 years old, and he was becoming something the country did not have a category for yet. A black athlete who was nationally famous in a way that crossed racial lines, who white Americans were watching and rooting for in numbers that had not existed before, who was becoming, despite every institutional effort to contain black excellence within black spaces, a figure the mainstream could not ignore. Then came Max Schmeling. Max Schmeling was a German heavyweight, former world champion, a man built like the ideology his government was selling, and when the two men were matched in June of 1936, the fight carried political weight that boxing matches are not normally asked to carry. Hitler's Germany had been publicly claiming for 3 years that the Germanic people represented the biological pinnacle of human evolution. Here was a German fighter against a black American fighter in a country debating whether to send its athletes to Berlin for Hitler's Olympics. The symbolism was not subtle. Nobody pretended it was. Joe Louis was the heavy favorite. He had knocked out 27 consecutive opponents. He had not been seriously challenged. The boxing world expected the fight to be over quickly. Schmeling had done something nobody else had done. He had studied film of Joe Louis with the specific attention of a man who understood that the distance between losing and winning was a technical detail if you could find it, and he found it. When Joe Louis threw his left jab, he dropped his left hand slightly on the return. It was a small opening. It lasted a fraction of a second. It was enough. Schmeling planned the entire fight around it. On June 19th, 1936, at Yankee Stadium, Max Schmeling knocked Joe Louis down in the 4th round with a right hand that came through exactly the opening the film had shown him. He knocked him down again, and again. The fight was stopped in the 12th round. Joe Louis, the man who was supposed to be unbeatable, the man that Black America had built into something larger than a boxer, lost. He was knocked out. The reaction in Black America was devastating in a way that requires some explanation to people who did not live inside it. This was not the reaction to a sporting loss. This was the reaction to a loss that carried the weight of everything Joe Louis had been asked to carry, everything his management had built him to represent, the proof of capability that every Black American needed him to embody in a country that was constantly telling them they were less than. When Schmeling's right hand put Louis on the canvas, Germany's propaganda machine immediately absorbed it as confirmation of Aryan supremacy. Nazi newspapers published pieces about what Schmeling's victory proved about race and biology and the natural order of human hierarchy. The sports result was transformed instantly into ideological ammunition. That was not Schmeling's doing. He was a boxer. He had found a flaw in an opponent's technique and exploited it. But the machinery around him was not interested in the technical boxing story. It wanted the racial story, and the racial story was right there, available, and it took it. Joe Louis went back to his corner, and his team, and his gym. He fixed the flaw. He fixed it the way serious athletes fix the things that defeat them, by going back to the beginning, by dismantling the habit that created it, and building something new in its place. By doing the work in private that nobody watches and that produces the results that everybody sees. He spent 2 years fighting other opponents, improving, building toward what everyone understood was coming, which was a rematch with Max Schmeling that the whole world would be watching. In June of 1937, he fought James Braddock for the heavyweight championship of the world and won it in the 8th round. He was the heavyweight champion. He was 23 years old. He was the first black heavyweight champion since Jack Johnson, which means the first in more than 2 decades, which is not a coincidence. It is the record of an institution that had spent 20 years trying to keep the heavyweight title white and had run out of white heavyweights capable of keeping it. The rematch with Schmeling was scheduled for June 22, 1938, Yankee Stadium, a Wednesday night. And in the weeks before it, something happened that had never happened before in American history and would have seemed to anyone paying attention to the actual conditions of black American life essentially impossible. The President of the United States invited Joe Louis to the White House. Franklin Roosevelt had not sent Jesse Owens a telegram after the Berlin Olympics. He had not acknowledged the 4 gold medals. He had left Owens to ride freight elevators to his own receptions. But Joe Louis was different in one specific political sense. The war in Europe was coming. Everyone who was paying attention knew it was coming. Hitler's Germany was rearming, expanding, threatening. The American public was not yet ready for the United States to enter another European war, but the administration was watching the horizon and understanding what was there. And here was a fight. One specific boxing match that had been loaded by circumstance and politics into something with enormous symbolic weight. An American fighting a German. A black American fighting a German in a country whose government said black people were subhuman. In front of 70,000 people at Yankee Stadium and an estimated 70 million on the radio worldwide. Roosevelt wanted Louis to win, not just as a boxing fan, as a politician who understood what the win would mean and what the loss would mean. In the story, the country was beginning to tell itself about what it stood for and what it was willing to fight. He invited Louis to the White House and he gripped his arms and he said, according to the account Louis later gave, "We need muscles like yours to beat Germany." Joe Louis went back to training. On the night of June 22nd, 1938, the radios went on across black America. This is not a metaphor or a composite image. This is documented in the accounts of people who were there. In the South, where many black families still lived, people gathered around the single radio in the community and sat in silence, waiting for it to begin. In northern cities, bars and churches and living rooms filled with people who could not afford to be at Yankee Stadium, but were not going to miss a second of this. Maya Angelou, who was 10 years old in Stamps, Arkansas on that night, later wrote about what it meant to sit in her grandmother's store and listen to the fight on the radio, what it meant for the black community packed into that store, what it meant that everything they felt about their own lives and their own dignity and their own place in an America that had decided they were secondary was concentrated into the body of one man inside a boxing ring in New York City. She wrote about what the silence before the fight felt like and what would have happened if Louis had lost, which was that all those people would have walked home in the dark, in silence, without speaking to each other, because there would not have been words for what that loss would have meant. He did not lose. The opening bell rang at approximately 10 o'clock. What happened next lasted 2 minutes and 4 seconds. Joe Louis attacked from the first moment. There was no feeling out, no caution, no early round positioning. He attacked immediately, and he attacked with the totality of everything Jack Blackburn had built, and every session in the gym since the first Schmeling fight, and everything he had ever understood about what this specific fight meant. He hit Schmeling with a right hand in the first seconds. He hit him with a left hook. He drove him to the ropes. He knocked him down. Schmeling went down and got up, and Louis knocked him down again. Schmeling went down a third time. His corner threw in the towel. The referee stopped the fight. 2 minutes and 4 seconds. The radio announcers struggled to keep up. The crowd at Yankee Stadium made a noise that people who were there described for the rest of their lives as something they had never heard before in any arena for any reason. And across black America, in the store in Stamps, Arkansas, in the bars on the south side of Chicago, in the living rooms and churches and street corners of every city where black Americans had gathered to listen, the silence broke. People ran into the streets. People who did not know each other embraced each other. People who had been maintaining for years, decades, lifetimes, the composed exterior that survival inside Jim Crow required, the performance of accommodation and deference and careful emotional management, let go of it. For that night, in those streets, they let go of it. Richard Wright, who would become one of the most important writers in American literature, described watching Black Chicago respond to the Louis victory. He described men and women filling the streets, automobiles honking, strangers holding on to each other, people laughing and crying simultaneously. The release of something that had been held under pressure for so long that when it finally came out, it had a physical force to it. He said that he understood in that moment that the Louis victory was not about boxing. He said it was the first time his people had been allowed to feel free in America. The first time. He was not speaking casually. He was a precise writer, describing a precise emotional fact. Joe Louis had just knocked out Max Schmeling in 2 minutes and 4 seconds, and the President of the United States had called him a national hero, and 70 million people had listened to it happen, and Black America had poured into the streets, and something had shifted in the story America was willing to tell about its black citizens. Not permanently, not sufficiently, not in ways that would change the law tomorrow, or end the debt peonage, or open the front doors of hotels. But something had shifted. The country had decided, in the specific logic of sporting nationalism, that a black man was its champion. That a black man's body was the body it wanted, representing it against the ideology that said some bodies were superior to others. The country had made that choice without quite acknowledging what it meant, without following the logic of it into the actual conditions of Black American life. But it had made it, and Joe Louis had made it make it. Now, Schmeling. Because the story of Max Schmeling is complicated in a way that the narrative of 1938 did not want it to be, and that subsequent histories have often simplified to the point of dishonesty. Schmeling was not a Nazi. He was never a member of the Nazi Party. His manager, Joe Jacobs, was Jewish, which is not a detail the Nazi regime was comfortable with. He refused requests to dismiss Jacobs. He was not enthusiastic about being used as a symbol of Aryan supremacy. He had no control over how his first victory over Louis was absorbed by the German propaganda machine. In November of 1938, in the days after Kristallnacht, when Nazi mobs destroyed Jewish homes and businesses across Germany and sent tens of thousands of Jewish men to concentration camps, Max Schmeling hid 2 Jewish boys in his hotel room, the sons of his friend and boxing promoter David Lewin, shielding them from the violence in the streets. He did this at real personal risk in a country where protection of Jews was a dangerous act. He did not publicize it. He did not want credit for it. He did it because there were 2 boys and he had a hotel room and the streets were not safe. He and Joe Louis became friends in their later years. Real friends. When Louis fell into financial difficulty, Schmeling helped him. He contributed to the costs of Louis's funeral. 2 men who had been loaded by history with the weight of an entire ideological war, who had been made into symbols of things larger than either of them had chosen, found each other on the other side of all of it, and recognized something more durable than the symbolism. That is worth knowing. It does not change what the fight meant in 1938. The meaning of June 22nd is real and documented, and was felt by 70 million people, including a 10-year-old girl in a store in Arkansas. But the meaning existed in a context that was more complicated than the symbol required it to be. That's almost always true. The symbol simplifies because it needs to. The truth is under the symbol. Joe Louis enlisted in the United States Army on January 12, 1942, 5 weeks after Pearl Harbor. He was the heavyweight champion of the world, and he enlisted as a private. He could have claimed an exemption. He did not. He had already donated the entire purse from 2 title fights to the Army and Navy relief funds. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. The money representing years of work, given to a country that was still debating whether black soldiers should be allowed to fight in combat roles. He gave the money. He gave the fights. He gave the years. He served in a segregated army that used his image on recruiting posters, and sent him around the country and overseas to build morale among troops who were segregated into black units, because the United States military had decided in its official doctrine that black soldiers were best used in service and support roles, and that integrating combat units would damage morale, by which they meant the morale of white soldiers who did not want to fight alongside black men. He trained at Camp Upton in New York, at Camp Seibert in Alabama, at bases across the South where the local conditions of Jim Crow extended onto the military installations, where black soldiers in uniform were treated as second-class citizens by civilian businesses, by military police, by the infrastructure of a society that had decided that wearing the uniform of the United States Army did not qualify a black man for the full dignity that uniform was supposed to confer. And at one of those bases, Joe Louis, the heavyweight champion of the world, the man whose fists the President of the United States had called on to defeat Germany, was denied access to a facility that German prisoners of war were permitted to use. The specific account varies slightly in different tellings, but the essential fact is documented and consistent. German prisoners, men captured fighting for the country that had made the ideology of racial hierarchy its official state religion, were accorded treatment on American military bases that black American soldiers were not accorded. They could eat in certain mess halls. They could use certain facilities. They were, in the logic of the American military of 1944, more acceptable in certain spaces than the black men who were fighting on the same side as the white Americans guarding them. Joe Louis saw this. He saw it, and he knew what it meant, and he knew there was nothing he could do about it that would not be absorbed by the military bureaucracy and come out the other side unchanged. He had given his purses. He had given his years. He had enlisted as a private when he could have stayed home. He had done everything the country asked, and the country had given him a base in Alabama, where the German prisoners ate in rooms he was not permitted to enter. He did not make a public speech about it. He did not write a letter to the newspapers. He continued serving, which is not because he didn't understand what it meant. It is because he understood it completely, and had been understanding it completely his entire life, and had not stopped serving the first time he understood it, or the 100th time, and was not going to stop now. The war ended in 1945. Joe Louis came home, and then the Internal Revenue Service came for him. This is the part of the story that requires sitting with carefully, because it is the part that reveals most clearly the specific way the country repaid what it owed. Louis had donated enormous sums to war relief during the fight years. He had donated his purses, reduced his taxable income through charitable giving, and lived the way a man who believed he owed something to his country lives. The IRS concluded that he owed back taxes on money he had donated to the military, not on income he had kept, on income he had given away. The tax law was being interpreted in a way that made charitable donations to the war effort taxable as income. It was not applied this way to white athletes who had made similar donations. The debt compounded with interest and penalties through the years he was serving, and the years he was fighting, and the years he was trying to rebuild after the war. And it grew into a number that he could not pay and would never be able to pay. The IRS pursued Joe Louis for the rest of his life. He was forced out of retirement to fight again, past the age when he should have been fighting, to try to generate enough income to address a debt that kept growing. He lost fights he would not have lost at 30 to men he would have destroyed at 30. He was knocked out in the 8th round by Rocky Marciano in 1951. He was 37 years old. He should not have been in that ring. He was in that ring because the United States government had decided that the money he gave to the war effort was taxable income, and the resulting debt required him to fight people. He had no business fighting. At an age, he had no business fighting them. He spent the last years of his life working as a greeter at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. The heavyweight champion of the world, the man whose fight the President of the United States had called essential to the national interest, the man who had knocked out the symbol of Aryan supremacy in 2 minutes and 4 seconds and made 70 million people hold their breath, and then release it into something that felt, for that one night, like the country he had been trying to live inside, of finally being honest about what he was worth. He greeted tourists at a casino because the IRS had taken everything else. He died on April 12, 1981, of cardiac arrest. He was 66 years old. Ronald Reagan attended his funeral. The President of the United States came to the funeral of the man his government had destroyed financially, the man the country had celebrated and then used and then taxed into poverty, and stood there and said the appropriate words about what Joe Louis had meant. The appropriate words were accurate. Joe Louis had meant everything they said he had meant. The gap between what he had meant and what he had been given in return for meaning. It is not a footnote. It is the whole story. There is a version of Joe Louis that the country is comfortable with. The brown bomber. The man who knocked out the symbol of fascism. The night in 1938 when the radio played in every black home in America and people poured into the streets. That version is real. Those things happened. They mattered in ways that are still working through history. But the complete version includes the rules he was given before he turned professional. The rules that told him how to exist in a country that needed to be managed carefully if a black man was going to survive in it. It includes the Camp Seibert base in Alabama and the German prisoners in the mess hall. It includes the IRS and the debt and Caesar's palace and the fights he had past the age of fighting them. The complete version is not a triumphant story, and it is not a tragedy. It is what it actually is, which is the story of a man who was asked to carry something enormous for a country that was not willing to be honest about what it was asking or what it owed in return. He carried it. That cannot be taken away. The fight lasted 2 minutes and 4 seconds. What it meant has lasted longer than that and is not finished lasting yet. We are going to leave Joe Louis now and go somewhere that most people think of as a purely domestic story, but is in fact the same story, the same war on a different front. We are going to go to the offices of a black newspaper in Pittsburgh, where in the spring of 1942, a man sat down and wrote the words that gave the entire fight its name. The double V victory abroad, victory at home, 2 fronts, 1 war, and the people fighting on both of them simultaneously. That is where we are going next. On January 31st, 1942, a 26-year-old cafeteria worker from Wichita, Kansas, sat down and wrote a letter to a newspaper. His name was James G. Thompson. He was not a politician. He was not a general or a civil rights leader or a man with any institutional power whatsoever. He was a cafeteria worker who was about to be drafted into the armed forces of a country that had not yet decided whether men who looked like him should be allowed to fight in combat roles. He had been thinking about something. He had been thinking about it the way people think about things they cannot stop thinking about, which is constantly, at the edges of every other thought, in the space between tasks. He had been thinking about what it meant to be asked to die for something you had not been allowed to fully have. He wrote the letter to the Pittsburgh Courier, which was at that time one of the most widely read black newspapers in the United States, with a circulation that reached into nearly every black community in the country, passed hand to hand in the South, the same way the Chicago Defender had been passed hand to hand a generation earlier, read in barbershops and churches and living rooms by people who understood that it was telling them the truth about the world they were living inside when most other newspapers were not. Thompson wrote this. He asked whether he should sacrifice his life to live half American. He asked whether the V for victory sign being displayed across the democratic countries fighting against aggression and slavery and tyranny should mean something specific to black Americans. And then he proposed something. He proposed that black Americans adopt a double V, 2 Vs. The first V for victory over the enemies abroad. The second V for victory over the enemies within. He wrote that the first without the second was not a complete victory, and that a complete victory was what he intended to fight for. The Pittsburgh Courier ran the letter. Then it ran it again. Then it built an entire campaign around it. Within weeks, the double V was everywhere in black America. Double V gardens, double V hairstyles, a specific style worn as a public statement of what the wearer was committed to. Double V clubs in cities across the country, organizations built specifically around the idea that the fight against fascism overseas and the fight against racism at home were not 2 different fights, but one fight with 2 fronts, and that the second front was as legitimate and as urgent as the first, and that any American who believed in the stated values of the war needed to be honest about both. J. Edgar Hoover decided immediately that this was seditious. Hoover had been running the FBI since 1924 and would run it until 1972, which is a tenure that covers most of the most significant political events of 20th century American history, and which produced in Hoover a worldview shaped by the specific assumption that black political organization was inherently suspicious, that any movement by black Americans to claim the full rights of citizenship was a potential national security threat. He had been monitoring black newspapers and black leaders since the 1920s. He monitored Marcus Garvey. He monitored the NAACP. He monitored A. Philip Randolph. He monitored Paul Robeson. The monitoring was not passive. It was active surveillance designed to find material that could be used to prosecute or discredit the people being watched. Hoover looked at the Double V campaign and saw sedition. He sent agents to interview the editors of the Pittsburgh Courier. He pushed the Justice Department to consider prosecuting the newspaper under the Espionage Act, the same law that had been used to prosecute critics of the First World War. The argument was that encouraging black Americans to think of racism as an enemy equivalent to fascism was damaging to the war effort. That telling black men they were fighting two wars instead of one was the kind of thing that demoralized troops and undermined national unity. The Justice Department declined to prosecute. Not because they thought Hoover was wrong about what the Courier was doing, but because they understood that prosecuting a black newspaper for saying that racism was wrong in the middle of a war that was officially being fought against the ideology of racial hierarchy was the kind of contradiction that would be difficult to explain. The optics of charging a black newspaper with sedition for opposing racism while the country was fighting Hitler were not good optics, so they declined. Hoover kept watching anyway. He never stopped watching. The Double V was not simply a slogan. It was a framework for understanding something that black Americans had been experiencing without a name for it. The specific experience of being asked simultaneously to serve a country and to accept subordination within it. To fight for democratic values in Europe while being denied those values at home. To wear a uniform that was supposed to represent freedom, and then wear it in states where the uniform entitled you to nothing. Where a black soldier in uniform was still required to step off the sidewalk when a white person approached. Still turned away from restaurants and hotels. Still subject to the violence of local law enforcement that recognized no distinction between a civilian and a soldier if both of them were black. The Double V gave that experience a structure and a demand. It said not either or. Not serve abroad and wait patiently for things to improve at home. Both. Now. At the same time. The fight overseas and the fight at home are the same war, and we intend to win both of them. To understand what the Double Fi was responding to, you have to understand what the defense industry looked like in 1941. When Hitler invaded Poland in 1939 and the war in Europe began, American factories began producing the materiel of war at a scale the country had never seen. Tanks and aircraft and ships and ammunition and uniforms and boots, everything an army needs, produced in factories that were running shifts around the clock and employing workers in numbers that erased the last traces of the Depression economy. The war production boom was the economic transformation that the New Deal had been trying to produce, and had not quite managed. It put people to work. It built a middle class. It turned working class Americans into homeowners and savers and people with economic futures for the first time in their lives. It did all of that for white Americans. Black Americans, by and large, were not included. The defense industry in 1941 was almost entirely closed to black workers. Not informally closed. Formally, explicitly, documentably closed. North American Aviation, one of the largest defense contractors in the country, told a reporter that it was the company's policy not to hire black people, regardless of their qualifications. Curtiss Wright, another major contractor, said the same thing. The policy was stated without embarrassment or qualification because there was no law preventing it, and no institutional pressure requiring anything different. Black Americans could watch the defense boom from the outside, could watch the factories in their own cities hiring white workers and passing them over, could understand that the economic transformation being produced by the war they were being asked to fight was not being produced for them. Philip Randolph had been watching this for 2 years by the spring of 1941, and he had decided to do something about it that was either the most audacious political gambit in the history of the Black freedom struggle, or an act of catastrophic overreach, depending on your assessment of the risk, and which turned out to be the most consequential single act of political leverage by a Black leader since Reconstruction. Randolph was 62 years old in 1941. He was the founder and president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first Black-led labor union to win a contract with a major American corporation. The Pullman Company, which operated the sleeping car service on American railroads, employed more Black workers than almost any other company in the country in the 1920s, and it employed them in conditions that were a continuation of the service economy of the Jim Crow South, transported onto trains, low wages, no union protection, arbitrary discipline, work rules designed to maximize the company's extraction and minimize the workers' options. Randolph organized those workers over 12 years against the fierce opposition of the company and the skepticism of the broader labor movement and the active hostility of the FBI, and in 1937, he won. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters signed a contract with Pullman. It was the first such contract in American history between a major corporation and a Black-led union. That victory made Randolph the most credible labor organizer in Black America and gave him the organizational infrastructure that produced what happened in 1941. In January of that year, he announced that he was going to organize a march on Washington. 100,000 Black Americans marching on the nation's capital, demanding an end to discrimination in defense industries and the military. The date was set for July 1st. Franklin Roosevelt did not want this to happen. The reasons were several, and not all of them were cynical. The honest version is that some were about politics, and some were about war strategy, and some were about the genuine complexity of trying to hold together a political coalition that included both Black voters in northern cities and white Southern Democrats whose support was essential to everything the administration was trying to do. The cynical version is that Black Americans were being asked to die for a country that was not willing to risk its political coalitions on their behalf. Both versions are partially true, and they are not mutually exclusive. Roosevelt met with Randolph. He tried to persuade him to call off the march. He said the march would cause problems. He said it would be embarrassing. He said it would interfere with the war effort. He suggested that Randolph talk to some mayors in northern cities, that some phone calls could be arranged, that informal pressure could produce the results that a public march might damage. Randolph was not interested in phone calls to mayors. He wanted an executive order, a presidential directive issued under the authority of the presidency, formally prohibiting discrimination in defense industries and federal agencies. Not a suggestion, not a guideline, an order, binding on every company doing business with the federal government, something that could be enforced, or at least something that created an obligation to enforce. Roosevelt asked what it would take to call off the march. Randolph said an executive order. Roosevelt said he couldn't do that. Randolph said the march would proceed. Roosevelt said the march would be divisive. Randolph said discrimination was divisive. Roosevelt said he needed more time. Randolph said he had until July 1st. On June 25th, 1941, 5 days before the march was scheduled to begin, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802. It declared that there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. It created the Fair Employment Practices Committee to investigate complaints and enforce the order. It was the first presidential executive order on race in America since the Reconstruction era. Randolph called off the march. The FEPC was underfunded from the beginning. Its enforcement powers were limited. It could investigate complaints and make recommendations, but it had no authority to force compliance in the way a regulatory body with real power could have forced it. Companies found ways to technically comply while substantively continuing to do what they had been doing. Unions with discriminatory membership rules remained discriminatory because the order applied to employment, but not to union membership. And in industries where union membership was required for employment, the distinction was meaningful. The gap between what Executive Order 8802 promised and what the FEPC was able to deliver was a gap that people inside the Black freedom struggle recognized immediately and named clearly. But the order was real, and the effect it produced, partial and insufficient as it was real. Over the next 4 years, more than 2 million Black workers entered defense industries. They entered shipyards and steel mills and aircraft plants and munitions factories. They took jobs that had been explicitly closed to them 6 months before, and they did those jobs, and they built the tanks and ships and aircraft that the country needed to fight a war on 2 continents simultaneously. They built the material of the war against fascism, while the country they were building it for remained, in most of its southern states and in much of its northern practice, committed to the proposition that they were not full citizens. The Double V was not a slogan about this contradiction. It was a response to it. It was a refusal to let the contradiction go unnamed. James G. Thompson's letter from Wichita was not a radical document. It was a document that asked a simple question that the country did not want to answer. How can you ask us to fight for democracy abroad while denying it to us at home? How can you use the word freedom as the reason for the war and not apply that word consistently? The question was not complicated. The answer was. Or rather, the answer was simple, and the country was not willing to say it out loud, which is that it did not consider Black Americans full participants in the freedom it was defending, which was a position that became increasingly difficult to maintain in a war that was explicitly against the ideology of racial hierarchy. The Pittsburgh Courier and the other major Black newspapers pressed this contradiction every week. The Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American, the Norfolk Journal and Guide. They covered the war overseas, and they covered the war at home, and they reported both as the same story, because they were the same story, and their readers knew it. Their readers were the families of the men overseas. Their readers were the workers in the defense plants. Their readers were the people navigating daily life in a country that was asking them for everything and offering them a qualified version of what it offered everyone else. In June of 1943, the contradiction between what the country was asking and what it was delivering expressed itself in Detroit in the form of 3 days of racial violence that killed 34 people. The Detroit race riot of 1943 did not begin with the war, but the war was inside it. Detroit had been absorbing Black migrants from the South throughout the war years, families drawn north by the defense industry jobs that were, with varying degrees of access, actually available to Black workers in Michigan in ways they had not been a few years earlier. The city's Black population had grown faster than its housing could absorb, which meant overcrowding in the neighborhoods Black families were permitted to live in, which meant pressure on every shared resource, which meant friction in every shared space. It started on a hot Sunday night at Belle Isle, a park in the Detroit River, a fight between a Black man and a white man. The kind of fight that happens in crowded parks on hot summer nights that would normally be a police matter and nothing more. What it became was something else. Rumors spread on both sides in the hours after, each community hearing a version of events shaped by its own fears and its own grievances. White rioters moved through Black neighborhoods. Black residents fought back. By morning, the city was burning. 34 people were killed over 3 days. 25 of them were Black. 17 of those 25 Black victims were killed by the Detroit Police Department, not by the rioters, by the police. The men whose job was to protect the city's residents from violence were the source of most of the violence against Black residents. The pattern was documented by investigators afterward, the pattern of police who treated white rioters as a crowd control problem and Black residents as a criminal problem, regardless of what each individual was actually doing. The pattern of a law enforcement institution that absorbed the racial assumptions of the broader society and expressed them through the legal authority to use lethal force. The Detroit riot happened while Black men from Detroit were in North Africa and the Pacific fighting for the country that their city was burning inside. There are letters from that period documented in archives from Black soldiers overseas asking their families back home what was happening, whether the city was safe, unable to understand fully from their positions in North Africa or the Pacific what a race riot meant in practical terms for the people they had left behind. And letters going the other way, from families to soldiers, trying to explain something that could not be fully explained in a letter that would be read by military censors, trying to tell the truth about what was happening at home to men who were being asked to fight for what was happening at home. Hoover's FBI compiled reports on the riot. The reports noted the role of what the FBI called outside agitators, by which they meant the black press, the newspapers that had been writing about discrimination and inequality and the contradiction between the stated values of the war and the actual conditions of black American life. The lesson the FBI drew from the Detroit riot was not that the conditions producing the friction needed to be addressed. The lesson was that the people naming the conditions needed to be more carefully monitored. A. Philip Randolph looked at what followed. Executive Order 8802, at the FEPC's limited enforcement, at the race riots of 1943, at the continuing segregation of the military, at the German prisoners eating in mess halls that black soldiers could not enter, and he continued organizing. He had not stopped organizing. He would not stop organizing. In 1947, after the war was over, he would tell Congress that if the United States went to war again with a segregated military, he would counsel black men to resist the draft. He said it to their faces in congressional testimony. He said it clearly. He said he would rather go to jail than serve in a Jim Crow army. He said this as a man in his late 50s who had spent his entire adult life inside the machinery of American institutional power, trying to make it move. And he said it because he had watched what the war had produced for black Americans. The promise of the double V set against the reality of what the country had actually delivered. And he had concluded that there was a line beyond which accommodation was no longer the appropriate strategy. Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in July of 1948, desegregating the United States military. He cited the moral inconsistency of asking men to fight for democracy in conditions of racial segregation. He cited it as a matter of national defense. He cited it as the right thing to do. All of these were true. None of them were the complete story of why it happened, which was that Randolph had been pushing for it for years and had finally made the political cost of not doing it higher than the political cost of doing it. The Double V campaign did not achieve its goals during the war. The war ended with the military still segregated, with the GI Bill that was supposed to reward returning veterans being administered in ways that systematically excluded black veterans from its benefits, with the gap between what had been promised and what had been delivered as wide as it had been in 1941. James Thompson's question had not been answered. The enemies from without had been defeated. The enemies from within remained. But the framework had been built. The name had been given to the thing. The two V's stood for something that had always been true, but had now been stated clearly and published in the most widely read black newspaper in the country, and discussed in barbershops and churches and defense plant break rooms, and in letters going back and forth between the men overseas and the families at home. You cannot unsay a thing once it has been said clearly. You cannot unname a contradiction once it has been named. The Double V campaign named the contradiction that the country was living inside and demanded that it be resolved. The resolution would come slowly and incompletely, and at a cost that should not have been required. But it would come, because the people demanding it did not stop. James Thompson, the cafeteria worker from Wichita who wrote the letter, was drafted into the Army. He served. He came home. He is not famous. Most of the people who built the movements that changed the country are not famous. They are the people who wrote the letters and organized the meetings and staffed the booths and rang the doorbells and kept showing up. When showing up was hard and unrewarded, and when the gap between what the country was and what it was supposed to be felt unbridgeable. He wrote a letter. The Pittsburgh Courier printed it. Black America read it and recognized something in it. And the something it recognized had been building since the moment the country first asked black people to defend values it was not applying to them. That recognition named and organized and pushed and carried through years of resistance and loss and incremental gain and betrayal and continued resistance is the thread that runs through this entire story. We have been in the boxing rings and the Olympic stadiums and the newspaper offices. We are going to go now to the ocean, to a harbor in Hawaii on a Sunday morning in December of 1941, when the sky filled with Japanese aircraft and the ships began to burn, and a man whose country had assigned him to the kitchen picked up a gun. That is where we are going next. His mother wanted a girl. She had picked the name Doris before he was born, and when he arrived on October 12, 1919, in a sharecropper's cabin outside Waco, Texas, she kept the name anyway, adjusted slightly. Doris became Dory. He grew up answering to it without complaint, which tells you something about the kind of person he was, or at least the kind of person a black boy in rural Texas in the 1920s learned to be. Someone who absorbed the minor indignities quietly and saved his energy for things that mattered. There were enough things that mattered in Waco, Texas, in the 1920s. Complaining about your name was not high on the list. He grew up on his father's farm in Willow Grove, a small black community near Waco. His father, Dory Miller, was a sharecropper. The family farmed someone else's land under terms that looked like the same terms that had trapped black families in the South since Reconstruction. The same debt structure, the same accounting that always came out in the white landowner's favor, regardless of the harvest. The same system that the families leaving on trains to Chicago and Detroit were leaving behind. The Miller family stayed. They stayed and worked, and Dory grew up with the physical strength that farming produces. Broad-shouldered and powerful, the kind of young man who drew attention on a football field and in the rooms he walked into, not from any effort to draw it, just from the physical fact of him. He played fullback at Booker T. Washington High School in Waco. He was good enough that people noticed. He was not going to college. College was not a realistic option for a black sharecropper's son in Waco, Texas, in 1939, not in the way that it is discussed in guidance counselors' offices, not as a path that a family with that economic position could practically take. He needed work. He needed wages. He looked at his options. In September of 1939, Dory Miller enlisted in the United States Navy. This requires a moment to sit with, because the United States Navy of 1939 was not an institution that considered black men its equals in any operational sense. The Navy had a policy, formal and documented and enforced, that black sailors could serve only in the messman branch. Not in combat roles, not in engineering, not in gunnery or navigation or any of the functions that the operation of a warship actually requires. The messman branch meant cooking and serving food and cleaning officers' quarters and performing the labor of maintenance that ships require and that the Navy had decided black men were suited for. The Navy's position was not that black men lacked courage or physical capability. The Navy's position was that the presence of black men in integrated combat roles would damage the cohesion and morale of white sailors, which is a position that says something very specific about whose morale the Navy considered it its job to protect. Dory Miller knew this when he enlisted. He enlisted anyway. His options in Waco were not abundant, and the Navy at least offered wages and travel and a life outside the sharecropping economy that had shaped every generation of his family before him. He was assigned as a mess attendant 3rd class. He was assigned to the USS West Virginia, a battleship moored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. His job was to cook and serve food. He was 20 years old. He was one of the strongest men on the ship. The Navy had decided his proper function was the kitchen. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Dory Miller was below decks on the West Virginia collecting laundry when the first Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor at 7:48 in the morning. The attack came in 2 waves. The first wave targeted the battleships moored along Battleship Row on the eastern shore of Ford Island, the orderly line of American naval power that the Japanese military planners had spent months studying, and that the American military command had not adequately protected because the official assessment was that a coordinated air attack on Pearl Harbor was not a realistic threat. That assessment was wrong. The aircraft came in low over the Waianae Mountains, and the sailors who saw them first thought they were American planes, and then they started dropping bombs, and that thought ended. The West Virginia was hit by 2 bombs and 7 torpedoes in the first minutes of the attack. The torpedoes hit below the waterline, and the ship began to flood and list to port. Fire spread across the water from oil leaking from the hull. The captain of the West Virginia, Mervyn Bennion, was on the bridge when shrapnel from a bomb that hit the neighboring USS Tennessee tore through the structure and struck him in the abdomen. The wound was mortal. He knew it. He remained conscious and kept asking about his ship and trying to command it for the next hour while dying. Dory Miller came up from below. He came topside into what the survivors of that morning described later, with a consistency that speaks to the truth of it, as a thing that had no prior frame of reference, smoke and fire and noise at a scale that the mind tries to categorize as something familiar and cannot. He moved through it. He helped carry the mortally wounded Captain Bennion from the exposed bridge to a more sheltered position, which was not a small act in the physical conditions of that ship on that morning, which required moving a dying man through a burning, flooding, listing battleship under active aerial bombardment. He did it. And then he found a gun. It was a .50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft machine gun. It was unmanned. The sailor who had been assigned to it was gone, dead or wounded, or blown clear, and the gun was there, and the Japanese aircraft were still coming. And Dory Miller, mess attendant 3rd class, a man who had been explicitly excluded from all weapons training, because the Navy had decided his proper function was the kitchen, sat down behind it, and opened fire. He had never been trained on this weapon. The Navy had never trained him on any weapon. The Navy's position was that black sailors did not need weapons training, because black sailors were not going to be in combat roles. What he knew about the gun was what any attentive person who had spent 2 years on a warship might absorb through proximity and observation, watching other men handle equipment in drills, understanding the general mechanics of a thing from having been near it. That, and whatever a man discovers in the moment when the aircraft are coming and the ship is burning and the gun is there, and the choice is between sitting behind it and doing nothing. He fired it for approximately 15 minutes until the order came to abandon ship. In those 15 minutes, according to his own account and the accounts of witnesses, he hit aircraft. How many is disputed? The number that appears in official documentation varies between 1 and 4, depending on the source and the date the source was compiled. The Navy's official records are not consistent with each other on this point, in a way that itself tells you something about the institutional investment in carefully accounting for what Dory Miller specifically accomplished. What is not disputed is that he was behind the gun, and he was firing it, and he was hitting things, and the Japanese aircraft were aware of the fire, coming from that position on that ship. He kept firing until the order to abandon the West Virginia came. Then he left his post. The ship sank. Dory Miller was pulled from the water. He survived. He was 22 years old. He had just done something that any other sailor on any other ship doing the same thing would have been immediately and publicly celebrated for. He had manned an unmanned weapon under fire, without training, on a burning and sinking ship, and fired it effectively at the enemy aircraft attacking his ship and his shipmates. That is not an ambiguous act. That is not something that requires interpretation or context to recognize as heroism. That is the definition of heroism in direct and uncomplicated terms. The Navy did not name him. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, the story began to circulate. A black mess attendant had manned an unmanned anti-aircraft gun during the attack and fought back. The story moved through the informal networks that always carry information. The official channels are not distributing, through the sailors who had been there and told people who told other people. Through the early coverage that was specific enough to make it clear something significant had happened without being specific enough to say who. The Pittsburgh Courier began investigating. They pressed their sources. They filed inquiries with the Navy. They pushed with the persistence of a newspaper that had been covering the gap between what the country said about Black Americans and what it did to them for decades, and was not going to let this particular gap go unnamed. In March of 1942, 3 months after the attack, the Navy officially confirmed that the unnamed black hero of Pearl Harbor was Mess Attendant 3rd Class Dory Miller of the USS West Virginia. They confirmed it under sustained pressure from the black press and from civil rights organizations that had understood from the moment the story surfaced that what was being buried here was not just a name, but a symbol, the specific symbol of black heroism in the war that the country had decided to fight after December 7th. A symbol that the Navy's institutional logic was not prepared to accommodate. On May 27, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, pinned the Navy Cross on Dory Miller's chest aboard the carrier USS Enterprise in Pearl Harbor. The Navy Cross is the second highest combat decoration the Navy awards. Nimitz said that Miller's performance was above and beyond the call of duty. He said it clearly and on the record. The Navy Cross was real, and it was earned, and the ceremony was documented. Then Dory Miller went back to being a mess attendant. He was not promoted to a combat role. He was not assigned to weapons training. He was not given any position that would reflect what he had demonstrated he was capable of on the morning of December 7th. He was returned to the messman branch because the Navy's position on black sailors and combat roles had not changed because of what Dory Miller had done, and the Navy was an institution large enough and bureaucratically entrenched enough to absorb the contradiction between the Navy Cross it had just awarded and the mess hall it was returning its recipient to, and to do so without institutional embarrassment. His image appeared on Navy recruiting posters. His face, his story, his Navy Cross, used to encourage black men to enlist in a service that would assign them to the kitchen. The Navy was not embarrassed by this either. The logic, if you can call it logic, was that black men seeing Dory Miller's heroism recognized would be inspired to serve. The fact that the service they would be inspired to join would not permit them to perform the kind of heroism they were being shown was not a problem the recruiting poster acknowledged. It was not designed to acknowledge it. It was designed to fill the messman branch with willing recruits, and the face of the most famous black sailor in America was a useful tool for that purpose, regardless of what it implied about the institution deploying it. The Pittsburgh Courier and the NAACP pressed the Navy on Miller's assignment continuously. They wrote letters. They published editorials. They asked, repeatedly and in public, how a man who had been awarded the Navy Cross for valor in combat was still being assigned to serve food. The Navy's responses were bureaucratic and consistent. They cited regulations. They cited policy. They cited the structure of the messman branch and the role it played in naval operations. They did not explain how those regulations and that policy were compatible with the Navy Cross they had just given to the man asking for a different assignment, because there was no compatible explanation. There was only the policy, and the policy was the policy, and that was what the Navy had. The black press named this what it was. They said the man who defended his ship at Pearl Harbor was being kept in the kitchen. They said it plainly, and they said it repeatedly. They said that the gap between what the Navy was willing to celebrate publicly and what the Navy was willing to change institutionally was the gap at the center of everything they had been writing about for 20 years. The Double V campaign had a face now. The face was a 22-year-old mess attendant from Waco, Texas, wearing a Navy Cross and carrying a food tray. The Navy eventually made limited concessions to the pressure building in 1942 and 1943, allowing some black sailors into non-combat ratings beyond the messman branch, assigning some to the newly commissioned all-black destroyer escort crews that were themselves a compromise between integration and continued segregation. These were steps. They were partial steps that moved in the right direction and left the fundamental structure largely intact. Dory Miller was eventually transferred. He was assigned to the escort carrier USS Liscum Bay, a ship operating in the Pacific. On November 24, 1943, the Liscum Bay was operating near Butaratari Island in the Gilbert Islands, supporting the invasion of Makin Atoll. At 5:10 in the morning, a torpedo from a Japanese submarine struck the ship. It struck near the bomb storage. The resulting explosion tore through the Liscum Bay with a force that survivors described as turning the ship into light. The vessel sank in 23 minutes. Of the 918 men aboard, 646 were killed. The ship went down so fast and the explosion was so catastrophic that survival was largely a function of where you were standing when the torpedo hit. Dory Miller was not in a position to survive. He was 24 years old. He had enlisted 5 years earlier as a mess attendant because the Navy would not have him as anything else, and he had spent those 5 years cooking and serving food and carrying laundry, and incidentally, on one specific morning, shooting at Japanese aircraft from behind a gun he had never been trained to use, and doing it well enough to earn the second highest combat decoration in the Navy. And then he had gone back to the kitchen and served his country, until his country's ship sank in the Pacific and took him with it. The Navy Cross was in his service record. His name was on the recruiting posters. The institution that had spent his entire career finding reasons to keep him in the messman branch added his name to the list of the honored dead and closed the file. His name did not disappear. The Pittsburgh Courier kept writing about him. The NAACP kept pressing for recognition. The question of whether Dory Miller deserved the Medal of Honor, which would have made him the first Black American to receive the nation's highest military honor from the Navy, has been raised and documented by historians and advocates for more than 80 years. The campaign continues. The argument is not complicated. The evidence is clear. What he did meets the criteria. What he was not given is the question that has not been fully answered. In 2020, the United States Navy announced that a Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier would be named the USS Dory Miller, an aircraft carrier, the largest class of warship the Navy operates. Named after the man who spent his naval career being told he was only qualified to serve food. When it is commissioned and when it goes to sea, it will carry the name of a man who was kept in the kitchen and died there. And the name will mean what names on ships always mean, which is that the country has decided at some distance from the events in question that this person represented something worth honoring. What it will not change is the 23 minutes the Liscum Bay took to sink, or the 5 years Dory Miller spent in a job the Navy gave him because it had decided he was not qualified for any other, which was a lie, documented by his own actions on the morning of December 7th, 1941, in the most direct and verifiable possible terms. He was 22 years old when he sat down behind that gun. He had never been trained on it. The ship was on fire and sinking. The aircraft were still coming. He aimed and he fired, and he hit them. That is what the man in the kitchen did with the gun he was never supposed to touch. We are going to leave the Pacific now and go to the American South, to a series of airfields in Alabama where the United States Army Air Forces was conducting an experiment it did not want to conduct, to prove a conclusion it was certain it already knew, which was that black men could not fly combat aircraft. The experiment was designed to fail. The men selected for it did not cooperate with that design. Their name was the Tuskegee Airmen, and what they did over North Africa and Europe and the skies above the Mediterranean is the next part of this story. In 1925, the United States Army War College published a study. It was a formal document, authored by senior officers, submitted through official channels, filed in the institutional memory of the United States military as something close to settled doctrine. The study's conclusion was this: black men were mentally inferior to white men. They lacked the decisiveness, the leadership capacity, the emotional control, and the technical aptitude required for combat roles. They performed best in labor and service functions under white supervision. They were suited for carrying supplies and cooking food and maintaining equipment. They were not suited for fighting. The study said this in 1925, and the United States Army used it as official justification for its racial policies for the next 15 years. It was not a fringe document. It was not the opinion of one eccentric officer. It was institutional doctrine, produced by the institution, endorsed by the institution, deployed by the institution, every time someone asked why black men were not being trained for combat, why black men were not being commissioned as officers in meaningful numbers, why the United States military, the armed force of a country that described itself as a democracy, was organized along racial lines that would not have looked unfamiliar to the architects of Jim Crow. There was one specific conclusion in the 1925 study that would become particularly important in the years that followed. The study concluded that black men lacked the mental and emotional capacity to fly aircraft. Not the physical capacity, the mental and emotional capacity. The study said that the demands of aviation, the technical skill required, the split-second decision-making under pressure, the psychological steadiness in extreme conditions were beyond what black men could be expected to provide. The study was wrong. This is not a complicated historical judgment or a contested interpretation. It was wrong in the specific, verifiable, documented way that a factual claim is wrong when the evidence produced by reality directly contradicts it. The evidence that proved it wrong was produced by more than 900 men who trained at a small airfield in Alabama, and then flew more than 15,000 combat sorties over North Africa and Europe and demonstrated, in terms that left no room for interpretation, that the 1925 study was not science. It was ideology dressed up as science, the same thing it had always been, and the men who proved it wrong knew exactly what they were proving and intended to prove it, and did. Their name was the Tuskegee Airmen. This is their story. To understand how the Tuskegee program came to exist, you have to understand that it was not created because the Army wanted to train black pilots. It was created because the Army was pressured into it by forces it could not fully control, designed in ways intended to minimize what it produced, and maintained under conditions that expressed, in daily institutional practice, the contempt that its creators felt for the experiment they had been forced to run. The pressure began building in the late 1930s. Black newspapers and civil rights organizations had been watching the country prepare for war, with an increasingly sharp eye on the question of what role black Americans would play in it. The Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier ran stories about black men learning to fly through civilian programs, about the small but growing community of black aviators being trained at institutions like the Coffee School of Aeronautics in Chicago, where a man named Cornelius Coffee and a woman named Willa Brown were teaching black men and women to fly at a time when the military was telling them that flying was beyond their capacity. Willa Brown was the first black woman in the country to earn a commercial pilot's license. She trained pilots in Chicago while the Army said it couldn't be done. She kept training pilots anyway. The people she trained included men who would eventually serve in the Army Air Forces, despite the Army's best efforts to keep them out. The legal opening came in 1939, when Congress passed the Civilian Pilot Training Act and included a provision, pushed through by black advocates in the legislative process, that black colleges must be included in the program. Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which had been doing aviation work under the direction of a man named Charles Alfred Anderson, was one of the colleges that qualified. Charles Anderson was known as Chief. He was the first black man in the United States to earn a commercial pilot's license, having taught himself to fly largely through persistence and borrowed aircraft at a time when no flight school in the country would accept him. He had been flying for years by the time the Tuskegee program was formalized, accumulating hours and ratings and credentials through a process of systematic self-education that the institutions designed to provide that education had declined to offer him. He was teaching at Tuskegee when Eleanor Roosevelt visited in April of 1941. Eleanor Roosevelt's visit to Tuskegee is one of those moments in history that is small in its immediate physical scale and enormous in its downstream consequences. She came to inspect the civilian pilot training program. Chief Anderson offered to take her up. Her Secret Service detail was not enthusiastic about this. She went anyway. She flew with Chief Anderson over Alabama for about an hour and came down and told the press that she had always heard that black people could not fly and that she had just discovered that was not true. This was not a casual remark. Eleanor Roosevelt was not a casual person on matters of race. She had been a consistent and public advocate for black civil rights in ways that created ongoing friction with the Southern Democrats whose support the administration needed. Her statement after the Tuskegee flight was a deliberate signal, calculated to advance a specific outcome, which was the expansion of the program from civilian to military aviation training. The photographs of her in the aircraft with Chief Anderson were published across the country. The optics were unambiguous. The First Lady of the United States had just demonstrated that the Army's official doctrine on black aviators was nonsense, and she had done it in an airplane over Alabama. Franklin Roosevelt directed the Army to establish a military flight training program for black pilots. The Army complied in the way that institutions comply with directives they oppose, which is by doing the minimum required and designing the compliance to produce the failure that would justify ending it. They chose Tuskegee, Alabama, partly because it was already doing civilian aviation work, but primarily because locating it in the Deep South meant the program could be contained within the existing architecture of segregation. A training facility in the South would produce pilots who would train separately, live separately, be evaluated separately, and could be dismissed separately when they inevitably failed to meet the standard, which the Army was confident they would fail to meet because the 1925 study said they would, and the Army believed the study. They did not fail. The first class of black military aviators graduated from Tuskegee Army Airfield on March 7, 1942. 5 pilots earned their wings that day. The first was Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who would command the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the first black military aviation unit in American history, and who would go on to command the 332nd Fighter Group in the skies over Europe, and who would eventually retire from the Air Force as a 4-star general, and who had graduated from West Point in 1936 35th in a class of 276 after spending 4 years in complete social isolation. Davis's 4 years at West Point require a pause. He had been accepted to the academy through a congressional appointment and was the first black cadet at West Point in decades. The white cadets responded to his presence by silencing him, not informally, not in the casual way that social exclusion operates, deliberately, collectively, as a coordinated institutional practice. They did not speak to him. They did not eat with him. They did not room with him. They did not acknowledge his existence in any social context for 4 years. He slept in his room alone. He ate alone at a table in a dining hall full of cadets. He studied alone. He drilled with the Corps and sat in classes and appeared at formations and was treated throughout as though he were not there, as though the physical fact of his presence could be negated by the collective decision not to acknowledge it. He graduated, 35th out of 276. He graduated into the Army Air Corps as a commissioned officer in a service that did not want him and was preparing to train him as a pilot. It was confident would fail. He did not fail. The 99th Pursuit Squadron was deployed to North Africa in April of 1943. They flew P-40 Warhawks out of bases in Tunisia and then Italy, flying missions against German and Italian targets in the Mediterranean theater. They were attached to the 33rd Fighter Group under Colonel William Momier, a white officer who made no secret of his view that black pilots were not capable of the performance required of combat aviators. In September of 1943, Momier submitted a report to his superiors evaluating the 99th's performance. The report said the 99th was performing below standard. It said the black pilots lacked aggressiveness, that they broke formation under pressure, that they did not demonstrate the qualities required of combat pilots. The report was factually contested by the men in the 99th and by the data available from the missions they had flown. But Momier was a colonel, and they were the subjects of the experiment the Army had not wanted to run, and the report moved up the chain of command to General Henry Hap Arnold, the chief of the Army Air Forces, and it was used to begin a serious discussion about whether the entire Tuskegee program should be ended, whether black pilots should be withdrawn from combat operations, whether the 1925 study had been right all along. The black press got the story. The Pittsburgh Courier published it. The debate about the 99th's performance became a national story, covered in black newspapers across the country. The men in the 99th reading about the institutional effort to use Momier's report to ground them in the American newspapers that reached them in Italy. Davis was called back to Washington to testify before a War Department board investigating the question. He testified about what his pilots had actually done and what the data actually showed, and he testified with the precision and composure of a man who had spent 4 years alone at a table in a West Point dining hall and was not going to be moved by an institutional process that was trying to do to him and his men what the white cadets had tried to do to him for 4 years. The War Department board found that the 99th's performance was comparable to or better than other P-40 units operating in the same theater under similar conditions. Momier's report did not hold up against the actual mission data. The 99th was cleared. The Tuskegee program continued. And then it got better. In early 1944, the 99th was reassigned and consolidated with 3 additional black fighter squadrons to form the 332nd Fighter Group, commanded by Benjamin Davis. The 332nd was re-equipped with P-47 Thunderbolts and then with P-51 Mustangs, one of the finest fighter aircraft of the entire war, and assigned to fly long-range bomber escort missions over Nazi-occupied Europe out of bases in southern Italy. They painted the tails of their aircraft red. The red tails were not a formal designation. They were a practical marking choice that became something else. When the bomber crews flying the heavy B-17S and B-24S over Germany and Romania and Austria began to recognize the red-tailed Mustangs pulling up alongside them as their escort, the marking became an identity. The bomber crews called them the Red Tails. They called them the Red Tail Angels. They began requesting them specifically, which is a fact worth dwelling on. White bomber crews, operating in the fully segregated American military of 1944, were requesting black fighter pilots as their escorts by name, specifically and by preference, because of the reputation those pilots had built in the air over Europe. That reputation rested on a record. The 332nd flew long-range bomber escort missions with a consistency of protection that made them the most sought-after escort group in the theater. The claim most often associated with them, the one that appears on every monument and in every account, is that they never lost a bomber they were assigned to escort to enemy fighters. The historians have complicated this claim slightly over the years, noting that some bombers assigned to 332nd Escort were lost to anti-aircraft fire and other causes, and that the documentary record requires precision about what exactly is being measured. What is not complicated is the fighter escort record itself. In air-to-air combat, the German fighters that came after the bombers under 332nd protection encountered pilots who did not break formation, who did not abandon their charges, who stayed between the bombers and the enemy, and did their jobs with a focus and discipline that the men who had written the 1925 study had said was beyond black men's capacity. It was not beyond their capacity. They had known it was not beyond their capacity. They had been told it was, and they had decided to prove the telling wrong. And they had flown more than 15,000 sorties and completed more than 1,500 missions and destroyed or damaged more than 400 enemy aircraft as evidence of the proof. On June 9, 1944, 3 days after D-Day in Normandy, the 332nd attacked a German naval vessel in the Adriatic Sea using only their aircraft's machine guns, no bombs, no torpedoes, strafing it until it sank. Sinking a warship with fighter aircraft gunfire is not a standard combat achievement. It is the kind of thing that happens when pilots push what their aircraft can do, past the point that doctrine says it can be pushed, when the men in the cockpits are operating with a focus and aggression that technical analysis had said they lacked. On March 24, 1945, the 332nd flew the longest single mission of any Mustang group in the Italian theater. Bomber escort to Berlin, Germany's capital, the heart of the regime that had built its entire political identity on the biological inferiority of men like the ones in those cockpits. They flew more than 1,200 miles round trip, keeping formation with the bombers over the target and back, and over Berlin they encountered the Luftwaffe's most advanced aircraft, the Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me-262 flew faster than any propeller-driven aircraft in existence. It was the technological edge Germany had left to deploy, the last advantage of a collapsing military machine. 3 Me-262s were shot down over Berlin that day by P-51 Mustang pilots from the 332nd. Roscoe Brown, a pilot from New York, shot down one of them. A propeller-driven pilot shooting down the world's most advanced jet fighter over the capital of the Third Reich. The 1925 War College study had said this was not possible. The 332nd was awarded 2 Distinguished Unit citations. Davis was awarded the Silver Star. Dozens of individual pilots received Distinguished Flying Crosses. The decorations were real. The missions were documented. The German aircraft that did not return to their bases were gone because of men who had been told they could not fly. But the decorations were being received by men who were coming home on leave to a country that still had its architecture of exclusion fully in place. Who were landing at American bases and being turned away from officers' clubs because the clubs were for white officers. Who were putting on their uniforms with their combat ribbons and their distinguished flying crosses and being directed to the colored facilities at train stations and bus depots in the states they had grown up in and the states their bases were located in. Who were flying combat missions over Europe in the afternoon and reading in the Stars and Stripes about race riots in Detroit and knowing that the people in those riots were their families. In April of 1945, at Freeman Field, Indiana, 101 black officers were arrested. Freeman Field was a training base in Indiana, and the base commander had issued a local policy directive that effectively segregated the officers' club, designating it for white officers, while directing black officers to a separate facility. The Army's own regulations said that facilities on Army installations could not be segregated by race. The base commander's local policy directly contradicted the Army's own rules. The black officers knew this. They knew it specifically and deliberately. They had studied the regulation. They had compared the regulation to the local policy. They understood that they were being asked to accept a contradiction between what the Army said on paper and what the Army was doing in practice. And they decided that the appropriate response to that contradiction was to test it by attempting to enter the officers' club they were entitled to use. 101 men were arrested. 3 were court-martialed. One of them, Lieutenant Roger Terry, was convicted and fined, a conviction that stood on his record for 50 years until the Army finally set it aside in 1995. Thurgood Marshall, who at that point was the NAACP's chief legal counsel, and who would later become the first black justice of the United States Supreme Court, traveled to Indiana to represent the arrested men. The case became a landmark in the legal challenge to military segregation. One more document in the growing file of evidence that the Army's racial policies were incompatible with the values the country said it was fighting the war to defend. The men who had been arrested at Freeman Field flew their next missions. They came back to the base that had arrested them, and they put on their flight suits, and they got in their aircraft, and they flew. Because the war was still happening, and their job was still their job, and the contradiction between the arrest and the mission was not one they had manufactured, and was not one they could resolve by stopping. More than 900 pilots trained at Tuskegee. Approximately 450 deployed overseas. 66 were killed in combat or in training accidents. 32 were captured and held as prisoners of war. They flew over North Africa and Sicily and Italy and Romania and Austria and Germany and over Berlin itself. They flew in aircraft they had been told they could not operate with the skill required. They flew escort missions that bomber crews requested them for specifically. They flew a 4-star general out of Tuskegee, Alabama, where the program had been placed because the Army was confident it would produce failure and wanted that failure to be easy to contain. It did not produce failure. It produced the record. In 2007, 62 years after the war ended, the surviving Tuskegee Airmen were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in a ceremony at the United States Capitol. President George W. Bush said that he was humbled by their service and ashamed that it had taken so long to recognize it. The men in the room who were old enough to have heard the 1925 War College study cited against them, old enough to have been arrested at Freeman Field, old enough to have landed from combat missions in Europe and been turned away from the officers' club, sat in the Capitol Rotunda in their 80s and received a medal from the country that had spent the best years of their lives telling them what they were not capable of. It was 62 years late. It was insufficient as accounting goes. But the men who were there to receive it had built something that could not be taken back. The missions were in the records. The decorations were real. The ME-262s shot down over Berlin were shot down. The bombers that came home had come home. The 1925 study was wrong, and the record of the 332nd Fighter Group is the proof. That proof exists permanently in the history of the war, and no subsequent decision about medals or timing or institutional acknowledgement changes what it demonstrates. What it demonstrates is what the whole story demonstrates. What Jesse Owens demonstrated in Berlin. What Joe Louis demonstrated in 124 seconds. What Dory Miller demonstrated at a gun he had never been trained to fire. What James Thompson named in a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier. What A. Philip Randolph demonstrated by forcing a president to sign an order he did not want to sign. The same demonstration, made through different bodies and different fields and different kinds of courage, but the same essential fact. The thing they were told about themselves was not true. It was never true. It was a story told by a system that required the story to be believed in order to function. And they refused to believe it, and they proved it false, and the proof is permanent. We are going to leave the skies now and come down to the ground, to the mud and the cold of a European winter in 1944, to a column of tanks moving through France and Belgium and into Germany itself, to the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, who George Patton told were going into the war, not to be killed, but to kill, and who then did exactly that for 183 consecutive days of combat. That is where we are going next. They trained for 2.5 years before anyone let them fight. The 761st Tank Battalion was activated at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana on April 1st, 1942, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, in a country that had just declared war on the three Axis powers and was mobilizing everything it had. Men were being trained and deployed at a pace that the military bureaucracy struggled to keep up with. Units were going into combat with months of training rather than years. The Army needed tank crews, and the 761st was a tank battalion full of men who had been drilling and training and qualifying on Sherman tanks in the Louisiana heat for 2 years and then 2.5 years, while other units were shipped overseas and sent into the fight. The 761st was not deployed because the Army did not want to deploy it, not because the men weren't ready. The training record said they were ready, not because there weren't enough tanks or enough theater space or enough need. There was a war on 2 continents, and the need was constant. The 761st sat at Camp Claiborne because the Army's institutional position was the same institutional position it maintained across all branches, which was that black men in combat roles were an experiment it had not chosen to run and was in no hurry to run. The experiment at Tuskegee was ongoing and contentious. The idea of black men in tanks, commanding armor against German panzer divisions, was a further extension of that experiment that many senior officers were content to delay indefinitely. They trained anyway. They trained knowing the delay was not about their readiness. They trained with the specific discipline of people who understood that they were going to be watched when they finally got their opportunity, and that being watched was a condition they had not created and could not escape and had to perform under anyway. They drilled their gunnery until the scores were among the best in the Army. They maintained their vehicles with the obsessive attention of men who understood that a tank that broke down in combat killed its crew, and that nobody was going to give them the benefit of the doubt if their equipment failed. They trained at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. Louisiana in 1942 was Jim Crow in its full expression. The base was on Louisiana's soil, and Louisiana's racial architecture came onto the base with the civilian workers and the local law enforcement and the cultural assumptions of every white officer who arrived from the surrounding communities. The men of the 761st trained for combat against Nazi Germany while living in barracks that were segregated from the white units training 50 yards away, while being denied access to facilities their white counterparts used without thought, while some of them were assaulted by local law enforcement when they went into town on leave, while they received letters from home describing the same conditions they were being asked to fight against in Europe, playing out in the neighborhoods their families were living in. They trained through all of it for 2.5 years. On October 31st, 1944, General George S. Patton stood in front of the 761st Tank Battalion at Athainville, France, and delivered one of the most direct speeches any American general gave to any American unit in the entire war. Patton was not a gentleman, and he was not a progressive one. He was a product of his class and his era and his institution in ways that expressed themselves in the full range of attitudes that those origins typically produced. He was not giving the 761st a speech about civil rights or racial equality or the contradiction between what America said and what America did. He was giving them a combat speech because they were about to enter combat, and that was his job, and theirs, and he was very good at his job. He told them they were the first black tankers ever to fight in the American Army. He told them he would never have asked for them if they weren't good. He told them he had nothing but the best in his army, and he didn't care what color they were, as long as they went up there and killed the enemy. He told them their race was looking forward to them. He told them not to let their race down, and not to let him down. Read that last part again. Your race is looking forward to you. Don't let them down. Patton said this without apparent awareness of the weight he was adding to the weight the men in front of him were already carrying. They were not simply soldiers being sent into combat. They were representatives of an entire people's claim to full humanity, and a 4-star general was standing in front of them, telling them that the validity of that claim depended on how they performed in the next several months of armored warfare. Jesse Owens had been asked to carry that weight on a track in Berlin. Joe Louis had been asked to carry it in a boxing ring. The men of the 761st were being asked to carry it in a Sherman tank through the French winter. They carried it. The 761st entered combat on November 7th, 1944, near Morville-le-Vicq, France, attached to Patton's Third Army. They fought for 183 consecutive days without relief. 183 days. The Battle of the Bulge, the push through France and Belgium and Luxembourg, the crossing into Germany itself, 183 days of the kind of sustained armored combat that produces casualty rates that the Army measures in percentages of unit strength, because the absolute numbers are too stark to absorb. Some American units broke under conditions the 761st sustained for months without rotating out. They did not break. On November 8th, 1944, the second day of combat, a tank commanded by Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers hit a mine. Reuben Rivers was from Tecumseh, Oklahoma. He was 23 years old. He was built for the kind of physical endurance that tank combat required, large and strong, and apparently, from every account of those who served with him, constitutionally resistant to the kind of fear that stops men from doing what needs to be done when what needs to be done is extremely dangerous. When his tank hit the mine, the vehicle was disabled, and Rivers was severely injured. His leg was torn open by the blast to a degree that the medics who arrived assessed as requiring immediate evacuation. They told him he was being pulled back. He refused. He refused. He wrapped his own wound. He transferred to another tank. He went back into the fight. For the next 11 days, Reuben Rivers fought with a wound that any medical assessment would have classified as requiring evacuation. He led his platoon through engagement after engagement, through the freezing mud of the French countryside, through ambushes and minefields and German armor that the Wehrmacht was deploying with the desperation of a military that understood the war was ending and intended to make the ending as costly as possible for the people forcing it. He fought through all of it. His commanding officers repeatedly tried to get him to the rear. He repeatedly declined. On November 19th, 1944, near Guebling, France, his platoon was pinned down by concentrated German fire. German tanks and anti-tank positions had the road covered and were systematically destroying American armor trying to advance. Rivers made a decision. He moved his tank forward into the open, exposing himself to the full weight of the German fire, drawing it away from the pinned vehicles behind him, buying time and space for his platoon to maneuver. He was hit. The tank was destroyed. Reuben Rivers was killed. He was 23 years old. He had been fighting on a wound that should have sent him to a hospital 11 days earlier. He had fought anyway. And then, when it came to the moment of specific choice between his own survival and the survival of the men behind him, he had driven into the fire. His commanding officers submitted a Medal of Honor recommendation for Reuben Rivers immediately after his death. The recommendation was detailed and specific and supported by multiple witnesses and met every evidentiary standard the Army required. The recommendation moved through the chain of command, and then it stopped. The Medal of Honor was not awarded. The official records show that he received the Silver Star instead. The Silver Star is a significant combat decoration. It is not the Medal of Honor. The difference matters, and everyone who knew what Rivers had done knew the difference mattered. The recommendation sat in the files. Rivers was buried in France. His family was notified. The community in Tecumseh, Oklahoma, mourned him, and the Medal of Honor that his commanding officers had unanimously agreed he had earned was not in his service record. This was not an isolated case. In 1993, the Army commissioned researchers at Shaw University to review the records of black soldiers from World War II and assess whether racial bias had played a role in the denial of Medal of Honor recommendations. The study took 3 years. Its conclusion was clear. There was a pattern. Black soldiers who had been recommended for the Medal of Honor had received lesser decorations instead, and the disparity between the recommendation and the award correlated with race in ways that could not be explained by any other variable. Not geography, not branch of service, not the nature of the action, not the quality of the documentation. Race. In January of 1997, President Bill Clinton stood in the East Room of the White House and awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 black soldiers from World War II. 6 of the 7 received their medals posthumously. Only Vernon Baker, who was 77 years old and had spent 50 years wondering why what he had done in Italy in 1945 had not been recognized, was alive to receive his. He stood in the East Room in his suit, and he accepted the medal that was 52 years late, and he said that the long wait had not diminished what it meant. Reuben Rivers received his Medal of Honor in that ceremony, 52 years after he drove his tank into German fire to save his platoon. His family was there to receive it for him. Now, go back to the 761st in November of 1944 and move forward with them through the winter. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944, when Germany launched its last major offensive on the Western Front. 200,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks pushing through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg in a bid to split the Allied lines, reach Antwerp, cut off supplies, and force a negotiated peace. It was a desperate operation, and it nearly worked. The German advance overwhelmed several American units in the first days, capturing thousands of soldiers in conditions of cold and confusion that the Allied command had not anticipated. The 761st was in the path of it. They fought through the cold that the men later described as the defining physical fact of those weeks. Cold that froze gun breeches and engine oil and the fingers inside the gloves. Cold that turned the mud roads to ice at night and back to mud by noon and made every mechanical system on a tank a potential failure point. Cold that killed men who were not killed by the Germans. They held positions and counterattacked and supported the infantry alongside them and did the work that tank battalions do in the kind of combat that the Battle of the Bulge produced, which is the kind of combat where nothing is clean and the maps are always wrong and the noise is constant, and the men who survive are often not the ones who should have survived by any logical assessment, and the ones who don't are gone before anyone can make sense of why. They came through it. They kept moving east, through Belgium and Luxembourg, and across the German border into the country whose ideology had set everything in motion. Into Germany itself. Into the place that had produced the theory of racial hierarchy and the Nuremberg laws and the infrastructure of extermination that the Allies were beginning to find as they advanced. In the spring of 1945, elements of the 761st moved into Austria. What they found there requires speaking carefully, because the facts resist the kind of language that makes them easier to receive. There were camps, facilities constructed by the Nazi regime for the specific purpose of working people to death or killing them directly. Facilities built to process human beings as though they were material. Facilities that expressed in concrete and wire and gas chambers and crematoria what the ideology the Allies were fighting had always said it intended to do when it said that some people were subhuman. Elements of the 761st participated in the liberation of subcamps of the Mauthausen concentration camp system in Austria. They arrived at these places and found the people who had survived them. They found men and women and children who were living in conditions that defied the language of deprivation, because deprivation implies a failure of supply. And this was a design. It was constructed. It was the intended endpoint of an ideology that said certain human beings did not deserve to exist. The men of the 761st had been fighting that ideology for 6 months. They had been fighting it, simultaneously, in the form of the domestic version of it that the country they wore the uniform of had built and maintained. They had trained at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. They had been turned away from facilities on their own base. They had been delayed in deployment for 2.5 years because the Army did not believe they were capable of what they then proceeded to do for 183 consecutive days. They understood, as perhaps no other group of liberators could have understood, what it meant to be told by a system that you were less than human. They had been living inside a softer version of that message their entire lives, and they were the ones who opened the gates. Some of the survivors of those camps reached for the black soldiers who came through the wire in ways that the white soldiers who arrived alongside them later remembered and documented, reaching specifically for them. Some of those survivors were people who had themselves been told they were racially inferior, whose citizenship had been stripped, whose property had been taken, whose families had been systematically murdered by a government acting on the logic of biological hierarchy. They reached for the men whose government had told them something structurally similar, not identical, never identical, but structurally similar. And there was something in the reaching that went past language. 183 consecutive days of combat. The Battle of the Bulge. The crossing into Germany. The camps in Austria. All of it done by men who came home from it to a country that had not yet decided to give them the full rights of the citizenship they had bled for. The 761st was recommended for a distinguished unit citation during the war. It was not awarded. The recommendation was filed and not acted on. In 1978, 33 years after the war ended, President Jimmy Carter awarded the Presidential Unit Citation to the 761st Tank Battalion. The men who were still alive to receive it were in their 50s and 60s. They had been waiting a third of a century. Reuben Rivers was still in France. He would be in France for another 19 years before his Medal of Honor reached his family. The record of the 761st is permanent. 183 days. France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, Austria. The camps, the liberated. All of it is in the record, and the record does not change. And the 33-year wait for the citation does not change it. And the 52-year wait for Rivers' Medal of Honor does not change it. What they did is what they did. The country's acknowledgement of it was late and partial and continues to be incomplete. But the doing of it is not in dispute. Not by the German armor they destroyed. Not by the camps they opened. Not by the men who came home from behind that wire into the sunlight of May 1945, because the 761st Tank Battalion drove through the fence. We are almost at the end of this story, but there is one more movement to it that has to be told, because without it, the story ends in the wrong place. The war ended in August of 1945. The men came home. And what awaited them, and what they did with what awaited them, and what all of it eventually produced, is the final part of what this documentary is about. That is where we are going next. On February 12th, 1946, a man named Isaac Woodard boarded a Greyhound bus in Augusta, Georgia. He was wearing his Army uniform. He was wearing his service ribbons. He had been honorably discharged from the United States Army 3 hours earlier, at the end of 3 years of service that had taken him to the Pacific Theater and back. He was 27 years old. He was going home to his family in North Carolina. The war was over. He had survived it. He asked the bus driver to stop so he could use the restroom. The bus driver responded with the specific contempt that the Jim Crow South extended to black men who made requests in tones that were insufficiently deferential. An argument followed. When the bus stopped in Batesburg, South Carolina, the driver called the police. The police chief, Linwood Scholl, took Woodard off the bus and into an alley and beat him with a blackjack. He beat him about the face and eyes with deliberate force. He then arrested Woodard, charged him with disorderly conduct, and put him in the county jail. The next morning, when the jail realized he needed medical attention, he was taken to a hospital. The doctors who examined him concluded that the damage to both his eyes was permanent. Isaac Woodard, who had spent 3 years in the service of the United States Army and had survived the Pacific and had been honorably discharged that morning in his uniform with his ribbons, was blind for the rest of his life. Linwood Shull was tried in federal court on charges of civil rights violations. The trial lasted 1 day. The all-white jury deliberated for 28 minutes and acquitted him. The courtroom applauded the verdict. Shull was never punished for what he had done. He lived until 1997. Isaac Woodard was not alone, not in the specific facts of his case, which were unusual only in their severity, not in the broader pattern, which was not unusual at all. Black men returning from the war in their uniforms, men who had fought in North Africa and the Pacific and Europe and the skies above Germany, were being beaten and killed and terrorized across the South in the months after the war ended. Some were attacked while still in uniform, which was not incidental. The uniform was the provocation. The uniform said something about what the man wearing it believed about himself and his place in the country, said it in terms that the system of racial control that had organized Southern life for 70 years was not prepared to accept. The men who attacked returning veterans in uniform understood exactly what they were attacking. They were attacking the claim the uniform made. Sergeant John Jones was lynched in Louisiana in 1946 while still in uniform. Private First Class Maceo Snipes was the first black man to vote in Taylor County, Georgia in the 1946 primary, exercising the right he had just spent years fighting to defend overseas, and was shot and killed by 4 white men on his front porch the next day. Senator Theodore Bilbo of Mississippi told white Mississippians that they knew what to do to keep black men from voting, speaking on the floor of the Senate, and what they knew what to do was what they had always done. President Harry Truman received the reports on the violence against returning veterans in 1946, and later said that the Woodard case specifically, when he was briefed on it, turned his stomach, and he could not have slept at night if he had not done something about it. He created a civil rights committee that year. He desegregated the military in 1948. These are the years between the end of the war and the beginning of what history calls the civil rights movement, and they are years that the triumphant narrative of American victory in World War II has often glossed over because they are not easy to hold alongside the victory. A country that had just defeated the ideology of racial hierarchy was beating its black veterans to death for voting and blinding them on buses 3 hours after discharge. Both of these things were happening simultaneously, and they are not separate stories. They are the same story. Now, the GI Bill, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, known as the GI Bill, is one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in American history. It provided returning veterans with access to low-interest home loans, college tuition assistance, unemployment insurance, and business loans on terms that made the middle-class American life of the post-war decades possible. 8 million veterans used its education benefits. Millions more bought homes under its loan programs. The suburbs that reshaped American geography in the 1950s were built largely by white families who accessed home ownership through the GI Bill. The college-educated professional class that defined the post-war economy was built largely by white men who went to school on the GI Bill. It is not an exaggeration to say that the GI Bill created the modern American middle class. It created the white American middle class. Because the administration of the GI Bill, like the administration of every New Deal-era federal program before it, was routed through local institutions, and the local institutions of the American South, and the banks and universities, and VA offices of the North, were institutions that discriminated. Southern banks refused to process VA home loans for black applicants. Southern universities turned away black veterans, regardless of their eligibility. The VA hospitals in the South that were supposed to serve black veterans were segregated and under-resourced to a degree that made the benefit effectively inaccessible. Northern universities accepted black veterans at rates far below their representation in the veteran population. The neighborhoods where black families were permitted to buy homes were redlined, excluded from the federal mortgage guarantee program that made GI Bill homeownership possible, meaning that the same program that was building wealth for white veterans was unavailable in the places black veterans were permitted to live. The GI Bill was not explicitly racially discriminatory. It did not say white veterans only. It said all veterans. And then it was administered entirely through the existing infrastructure of American racism, which produced outcomes as racially skewed as if it had said white veterans only. The men who had served in the 761st and the 332nd and on the USS West Virginia, and in the segregated infantry divisions across the European and Pacific theaters, came home to a benefit that their white counterparts were receiving, and they were not for the same actions, in the same war, under the same flag. The wealth gap between black and white Americans that persists into the present day was not created by the GI Bill. It was created by everything that had come before it. But the GI Bill, administered as it was, took the existing gap and widened it at precisely the moment when it could have begun to close, in precisely the years when the returning veterans, black and white, were making the economic decisions that would determine the financial position of their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. That widening has never been fully accounted for. The accounting remains incomplete. But something else was happening in those years, alongside the exclusion and the violence and the injustice, so routine it barely registered in the white American press. The men who came home had been somewhere. They had been to Europe and North Africa and the Pacific, and they had seen things and done things and understood things that could not be taken back. They had been to countries where black men were treated as men. They had fought alongside white Americans who, under the specific pressure of combat, had sometimes related to them as fellow soldiers rather than as black soldiers, which is a different thing, and they knew the difference. They had lived inside the contradiction of fighting for democracy while being denied it for long enough that the contradiction had clarified into something with a sharp edge. And they were done. Not done in the sense of giving up. Done in the sense of being finished with accepting conditions they had accepted before the war because there had seemed to be no alternative. The war had shown them alternatives. The war had shown them that systems could be challenged, that official doctrine could be proven wrong, that what an institution said was impossible could be made possible by sufficient will and skill and refusal to accept the institutional verdict. The 1925 War College study had said black men couldn't fly. The 332nd had flown to Berlin. The Army had said the 761st wasn't ready for combat. The 761st had fought for 183 consecutive days. If those things were possible, then what else was possible? Medgar Evers came home from the war and tried to vote in Decatur, Mississippi in 1946 and was turned away by a white mob with guns. He did not stop. He became the NAACP field secretary for Mississippi. He organized. He investigated murders and reported them. He registered voters. He kept going until June 12, 1963, when he was shot in his own driveway in Jackson, Mississippi by Byron De La Beckwith, who was tried and acquitted by 2 all-white juries and lived free for 30 years before a third trial finally convicted him in 1994. Medgar Evers was 37 years old when he was killed. He had been a soldier. He had come home and chosen a different kind of combat, and had fought it until it killed him. Amzie Moore came home to Cleveland, Mississippi, and became one of the principal organizers of the NAACP in the Delta, building the voter registration infrastructure that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee would later use to run Freedom Summer. He had fought in the Pacific. He knew the distance between what the country said it was and what it was. He spent the rest of his life working the distance. E.D. Nixon, a Pullman porter and protege of a Philip Randolph, was the man who organized the Montgomery bus boycott before Rosa Parks' arrest gave it its catalyst, who had been building the infrastructure of that boycott for years, who recognized what Parks' arrest meant and called the people who needed to be called within hours. The Montgomery bus boycott did not begin on December 5th, 1955. It began in the years of organizing that Nixon and others had done before that date, building the organizational capacity that made a sustained boycott possible, and that organizing was built by people who had lived through the war years and drawn from them the conclusion that systematic pressure on systematic injustice could produce results. Thurgood Marshall, who had represented the Freeman Field 101 in Indiana in 1945, argued Brown versus Board of Education before the Supreme Court in 1954. He had spent the preceding years dismantling, case by case and circuit by circuit, the legal architecture of separate but equal, building the evidentiary record and the legal theory that NAACP attorneys had been developing since the 1930s, and that he brought to completion in the case that ended legal school segregation. The work was the work of a generation, built by people who had been told no for decades and had kept asking anyway. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was not separate from the story of the men and women who fought fascism in the 1930s and 1940s. It was built by them. It was built on the organizational infrastructure they had created, the legal strategies they had developed, the political leverage they had demonstrated was possible, the cultural authority their refusals and their achievements had accumulated. Jesse Owens and Joe Louis did not organize the Montgomery bus boycott, but the world in which the Montgomery bus boycott was possible was shaped by what they had done and what it had meant and what it had demonstrated about who Black Americans were and what they were capable of and what the ideology that said otherwise was worth. The Double V campaign named the fight. The Tuskegee Airmen proved what the fight was against. Dory Miller embodied what the fight cost to ignore. A. Philip Randolph showed what the fight could accomplish when organized correctly. The 761st showed what the fight looked like when the gates opened and the people inside reached for the men who had come to open them. And the veterans who came home to beatings and blinded eyes and a GI Bill they couldn't access, and voting booths protected by men with guns made a decision that the men and women who had fought the first war before them had also made. A decision made in a cabin in Alabama, and on a northbound train, and in a gym in Cleveland, and in a boxing ring, and in a cockpit over Berlin, which was that what the system said about them was not true, and that the system was going to be made to demonstrate that it was not true, regardless of what it cost. It cost everything. It is not finished costing. So this is what we have. Jesse Owens stood in Hitler's stadium and won 4 gold medals and came home to the freight elevator. Joe Louis knocked out Max Schmeling in 124 seconds and donated his purse to the war effort and died in debt to the government he had given it to. Dory Miller sat down behind a gun he had never been trained to use on a burning ship at Pearl Harbor and fired it until the ship sank, and then went back to the kitchen and died in the Pacific on a ship the Navy had not told him was in danger. The Tuskegee Airmen flew to Berlin and came home to be arrested at a segregated officers' club in Indiana. The 761st Tank Battalion fought for 183 days and opened the gates of the camps and waited 33 years for the citation their commanding officers had recommended the day the war ended. James Thompson wrote a letter about the double victory, and the FBI decided it was seditious. A Philip Randolph made a president sign an executive order, and the president signed it, and the enforcement machinery was underfunded from the first day. None of it was sufficient. None of it delivered what it should have delivered, what the people who did it had every right to receive. The accounting that would make it sufficient has not been completed. It is still being contested. It is still being argued over in courts and legislatures and public discourse, and in the specific daily texture of American life, which continues to be shaped by the legacy of everything described in this documentary in ways that are not historical. They are present. They are ongoing. They are the reason the distance between what America says it is and what it actually is for all of its people remains a live question rather than a settled one. But here is what else is true. They refused. That is the permanent fact. Jesse Owens refused to run slowly. Joe Louis refused to lose the way the system needed him to lose. Dory Miller refused to stay away from the gun. The Tuskegee Airmen refused to fail the experiment that had been designed for their failure. The 761st refused to stay at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana forever. James Thompson refused to let the contradiction go unnamed. A. Philip Randolph refused to call off the march, and the men and women who came home from the war and found the same country waiting and refused to accept it again, who organized and voted and sued and marched and sat in and got arrested and got back up and organized again, were carrying what those refusals had built. They were not starting from nothing. They were starting from the record that had been accumulated, the proof that had been demonstrated, the organizational capacity that had been developed, the names that had been established as evidence of what Black Americans were and what they could do, evidence that the ideology opposing them had tried to prevent and failed to prevent, because the people producing the evidence refused to stop producing it. The civil rights legislation came, not as gift, not as the country deciding on its own to be better. It came because of the pressure that the veterans and the organizers and the marchers and the lawyers and the people who sat at lunch counters and the people who rode buses and the people who registered voters in Mississippi and the people who died for doing it applied to a system that did not want to move, applied for years and decades without stopping, until the political cost of not moving exceeded the political cost of moving. It was not the end. It was not the completion of the double victory. The second V has not been fully won. Anyone paying attention knows it has not been fully won. The distance between what the country says and what it does for all of its people is still a distance. The inheritance of everything described in this documentary is still being sorted out in ways that are political and legal and economic and deeply personal for millions of people alive right now. People who are the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the men on those trains, and in those cockpits, and behind that gun at Pearl Harbor. But the refusal is also permanent. It does not expire. It does not become less real because the work it started is not finished. Reuben Rivers drove his tank into German fire. That happened. The 332nd flew to Berlin. That happened. Dory Miller fired a gun he was never supposed to touch. That happened. Jesse Owens ran in Hitler's stadium and won. Joe Louis knocked out Max Schmeling in 124 seconds. Both of those things happened. A black man from the cotton fields of Alabama stood in the middle of Adolf Hitler's stadium and broke 4 world records. His country called him a hero and sent him home to the freight elevator and did not send him a telegram. He ran anyway. The record is in the books. It is not going anywhere. In June of 1938, when the radio went on in every black home in America and the country held its breath and 2 men climbed into a ring at Yankee Stadium, the fight lasted 2 minutes and 4 seconds. And when it was over and the radio announcers ran out of words and the streets of black America filled with people who could not stay inside, what was being celebrated was not just a knockout. It was not just a sporting result. It was the specific, documented, undeniable, permanent fact that the thing they had been told about themselves was not true. It was never true. They always knew it was not true. And for 2 minutes and 4 seconds on a Wednesday night in June, the whole world knew it too. The train that carried those 6 million black Americans north never stopped moving. The fight those men brought home from the war never stopped either. It changed shape. It found new forms. It produced the movement that produced the legislation, that produced the world that the descendants of all of it are still building and fighting for and arguing about and refusing to surrender. That is not a finished story. It was never going to be a finished story. It is what it is, which is the longest, most expensive, most documented, most stubbornly unresolved argument in American history. The argument about whether the country means what it says, about whether the words freedom and equality apply to everyone who lives under them, or only to the people who have always been allowed to define what those words mean. The men in this documentary made their answer to that argument without words. They made it in boxing rings, in Olympic stadiums, and burning ships and cockpits over Berlin, and tank columns in the Ardennes, and concentration camp gates blown open in the Austrian Spring. They said, yes, it applies to us. We are going to prove it. We are going to keep proving it until you cannot say otherwise. They have not stopped proving it. Neither have their children. Neither have their children's children. The proof is still accumulating. It has not stopped accumulating. It will not stop.